surprises, actually. Just when we think we might know what Boris is going to say, there is suspicion that he might push back on the lawyers today and say maybe lockdowns shouldn't have happened at all.
Well, because I think that's what he thinks.
Yeah, a bit rich of him to say that now. Could have done with him saying that in March 2020, but anyway.
And why did he, and the question is, why did he agree to lockdowns? Was it because what was happening abroad?
Yeah. Pressure from overseas, who knows? We're going to be talking about that, and also this strike, this junior doctors strike. Sorry, if it wasn't for this COVID inquiry today, no doubt this would be the top story of the morning.
Biggest strike in the NHS history, just for Christmas. Do they want a longer Christmas holiday? Yes, they do. Desperately cynical, in my view.
Don't go anywhere.
Wake up to the headlines with Headliners every morning at 5 a.m. We treat you to the day's biggest stories before anyone else, 7 days a week. You can catch up on everything you need to know before you've even had your kippers. Headliners every morning at 5 a.m, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Big news, big debates, big opinion. Patrick Christie's Tonight is the week's biggest show. Every weekday, 9 to 11 p.m, we've got the inside track on the day's top stories. There'll be sharp takes you won't get anywhere else. We will set the news agenda, not just follow it, and I want to bring you along for the ride. Whatever it is, we'll have our finger on the pulse. It's news, but it's this close to entertainment. Patrick Christie's Tonight, 9 to 11 p.m, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Now then, Lee Anderson here. Join me on GB News on my show, The Real World, every Friday at 7 p.m.
I'm not eating bloody cat. Are you
Delicious.
mental?
Open your mouth. OK, here comes a train.
Reminds me of the scene in Singing in the Rain.
Adam, is that a good one?
Whoa! Join me at 7 on GB News, Britain's news channel.
What you get for breakfast is something that, if we do our jobs right, you will wake up to news that you didn't know the night before.
It's a conversation. It's not just me and Eamon.
We want to get to know you, and we want you to get to know us.
From 6, it's Breakfast with Eamon and Isabel.
Monday to Thursdays on GB News,
Britain's news channel.
There's only 3 people you can trust in life. Your doctor, your lawyer, and your nana.
I'm not sure.
So join me, Nana Aquare, at 3 p.m. every Saturday and Sunday, where we discuss the biggest topics of the weekend. Be ready for battle. Could you be quiet? What is this?
It's my new teeth. It's your new teeth.
I don't bite. Well, not without a good reason. Always honest, always fun. Every weekend at 3 p.m. on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Every Sunday from 11, join Michael Portillo.
There'll be topical discussion, looking at the week before and the week to come. So kick back and relax at 11 a.m. on Sundays on GB News with me, Michael Portillo. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Michelle Dewberry, and I'm not here to tell you what to think. I'd much rather hear what you have to say. So, send in your opinions to gbviews@gbnews.com. Keep them clean, and you never know, I might read them out. With my panel here on Jubes & Co, we debate, we get stuck into the issues of the day on a show where all views are welcome, especially yours. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Have a great Saturday night with me, Leo Curse, on the Saturday Night Showdown. It's a crazy world out there, so come and make fun of it with me, my panel of comedians, and a couple of people who actually know what they're talking about. This Saturday Night Showdown is your front row ticket to the clown show, every Saturday, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Good morning, it's 9:30 on Wednesday the 6th of December. This is Britain's News on GB News with Andrew Pearce and Bev Turner.
Boris Johnson's showdown. The former PM faces the COVID inquiry this morning. GB News presenter Pip Thompson has more.
Accountability, not weak apologies. That is what relatives of bereaved families say they want this morning from Boris Johnson. There are many of them here. He has lots of questions to answer. Might explain why he's here for 2 days. He starts giving evidence to the COVID inquiry in less than 30 minutes.
The doctor won't see you now. Junior doctors are planning 9 days of strikes in December and January, the longest walkout in NHS history, just in time for the Christmas holiday.
And Rwanda resignations incoming. Rishi Sunak faces 10 ministers quitting over the Rwanda treaty if he decides to circumvent the European Convention on Human Rights to get the planes off the ground.
And a royal show of strength. The King, Queen Camilla, Prince and Princess of Wales were together last night in an event in Buckingham Palace. Meanwhile, Prince Harry's court case against the Home Office about his royal protection costs continue.
And Nigel's still going strong. Farage is one step closer to the jungle crown as he survives another elimination. Celebrating with a little dance last night. We'll show you that full clip soon. Brace yourself.
And I voted for him again.
Well done on your little app that a young person put on your phone for you. That's brilliant.
Yep.
If you want to vote for Nigel Farage, of course, he survived another night in the jungle. He needs your help. If you want to vote for him, grab your phone, scan the QR code on the screen and download the app. You can vote for him 5 times a day for free.
And remember, you're voting then also for GB News.
That's right. Let us know your thoughts this morning on everything we're talking about. Can I just say that royal picture of the 4 of them? Pure class.
The Fab Four, eat your heart out, Harry and Meghan.
Yeah, they've just risen above it all like they do. This is what the Queen would have done as well, in my opinion. What do you think? GBViews at gbnews.com is the email address. There they are, looking absolutely resplendent last night, smiling. You can imagine what they might be saying through gritted teeth about Harry and Meghan. First, though, this morning, the very latest news with Sam Francis.
Bev, thank you very much. Good morning. It's just coming up to 9:33. The headlines this hour. Boris Johnson is set to defend his handling of the pandemic as he appears before the COVID inquiry. The former Prime Minister is expected to admit that the government did make mistakes in its response to the virus, but argue that decisions save lives. He's already been heavily criticised by many of those who've given evidence, and it's claimed he was prepared to let the bodies pile high and was bamboozled by science. Gathering outside the inquiry, the families of those who died during the height of the pandemic are demanding answers.
People need to be accountable. These decisions led to the deaths of thousands of people who never should have died. If we'd have had a different government at the time that wasn't so callous and chaotic, thousands more people would have been alive.
I believe that Mr. Johnson's incompetent. He's incompetent to the degree that he employed people like Matt Hancock as a health secretary, who's clearly out of his depth. And I just really want to sit here and look him in the eye and see what he has to say.
Up to 10 MPs are threatening to quit over the government's hardline approach on Rwanda. The 10 senior Conservatives have issued a warning that overriding the European Convention on Human Rights would cross what they've called a red line. It's after Home Secretary James Cleverly signed a new treaty in Kigali yesterday, which he insists will resolve all of the Supreme Court's concerns. In November, they ruled against the plan to send asylum seekers to the East African nation, calling it unlawful. James Cleverly is due to deliver a statement in the Commons later to update MPs on a new agreement. Crime and Policing Minister Chris Philp told us this morning that everyone needs to back the government.
We need to make sure that this deal sticks, and the bill that's going to be prepared and presented in the near future will make sure that this is legally watertight, and that I think is something that everybody will get behind in Parliament. I think it's what the public expect to see as well, because illegal immigration on this scale is completely unacceptable, and the treaty that was signed yesterday and the bill that will follow will end that.
The High Court has been told that Prince Harry was singled out and treated less favourably than others over his police protection. The Duke of Sussex is taking legal action against the decision in 2020 that he wouldn't get the same personal security when visiting the UK with his family. The Home Office argues his position changed, though, when he stepped back from his role in 2020. The 3-day hearing, due to end tomorrow, is one of 5 legal cases that Prince Harry has pending in the High Court. And commuters are facing another day of travel disruption today as train drivers walk out in their long-running dispute over pay. Members of the ASLEF union at 5 operators are on strike for the next 24 hours. It's the latest in a series of stoppages this week. Some of the busiest commuter rail routes in the country will have limited services or no trains at all. ASLEF says its members will continue taking industrial action until they receive an improved pay offer on the one that was made earlier this year of just 8% over 2 years. And you can get more on all of those stories and many more by visiting our website, gbnews.com. Now, though, more from Andrew and Beth.
Very good morning. It is 9:36 on Wednesday morning. Big day for former Prime Minister Boris Johnson. He's going to take centre stage at the COVID inquiry shortly. What questions do you want to see him asked at home? gbviews@gbnews.com is the email address. Do you have any faith they're going to be asking the right questions?
Well, we understand from the briefings that Boris wants to talk about where this wretched pandemic came from. Michael Gove tried that, didn't he, a week or two ago? But he will be pushed back. I'd really like him to be pushed back against the lawyers. Let's see if he does. But I really want to know if his instincts were to resist lockdown, who persuaded him not to?
Absolutely.
That's what I want to
I'd
know.
like all of that. I agree with, and I don't think Boris will be allowed. I mean, it's typical Boris, isn't it, to want to go in there and to change the conversation to what he would like to discuss, and I applaud him for that because I think the wrong conversations are being had in that room. But I would like to see a little bit more emphasis on the data, on the facts, because we aren't seeing enough of that. There's too much he said, she said, why did he say this, and what was your relationship like? I don't care about their relationships. I don't care if they never talk to each other again, and none of them will be in power when the next pandemic is landed upon us by the World Health Organization. So until they start adhering to the facts and the data, all of it is pretty much meaningless, because that's all you need to look at, the facts and the data, and then you can come to the right conclusions. I also want to see records of things like, I don't know whether you remember, but when Dominic Cummings did a parliamentary interrogation before the COVID inquiry about what had happened, and he said during that time, Dominic Cummings used the phrase, we were talking to Bill Gates type people. Do you remember? He made that really interesting comment. We were talking to Bill Gates type people. I want to know, was Boris Johnson talking to Bill Gates and Bill Gates type people? Because Bill Gates type people were very much invested in the vaccines. And the lockdowns, if you remember from Ferguson's infamous report, 16th of March 2020, his report said that we needed these lockdowns to get ready for a vaccine. Well, if the vaccine was already ready and we needed to go into lockdowns because then they could roll out and make huge amounts of money, those are the questions I want asking. I don't think they're going to. They're just, I have very little faith. I feel like every single question. And do you know what? The media, I'm sorry, Andrew, you know I get off on one. And don't say Bev Turner's talking about COVID again.
She's on one.
You're lucky I'm here at a time like this. That's all I can say.
Favourite hobby horse, COVID, conspiracy.
Research topic, because you see, this used to be called researching and reading, and it was only when the pandemic suddenly it became, you don't want to do your own research. Don't look at things. Don't read things. That used to be, something we used to applaud people for doing, was reading and researching, but apparently not from 2020. Should we move on?
We do. We've got to, because there are other big stories happening, not least a flipping junior doctor strike, outrageous just for Christmas. But we're told that 10 ministers could quit over the government's hardline approach in Rwanda. Well, why doesn't Rishi just sack them?
That's right. Well, let's get the latest.
Get it over and done with.
Let's get the latest from our political editor, Christopher Hope, this morning. What is the latest, Chris?
Well, Andrew and Bev, this place is on resignation watch, not least those 10 members of the One Nation group, or the kind of moderate Tories, might resign if the PM goes too hard on trying to withdraw from elements of the Human Rights Act. But on the other side, if it's watered down, and I do understand this bill is being determined today and unveiled tomorrow to Parliament, it might well be that other ministers who support a hardline approach, like Robert Jenrick, the immigration minister, he will resign. So we are approaching an absolute critical moment this week for the Tory party, and indeed for the party's policy on migration, whether it actually wants to deliver what it said it would do and bring down those net numbers and also stop the boats, because there's a real concern that won't happen. With me now is Marc Francois. He's the European Research Group chairman. Marc Francois, last night with the New Conservatives, the Common Sense Group, a big group of right-wing Tory MPs, you announced a review of the treaty, and you'll be reviewing the bill when it's published. Why is that?
Yes, there was a meeting last night, as you say, several dozen Tory MPs
the ERG, the Common Sense Group, the New Conservatives. And between us, we ask the Star Chamber, as you media nicknamed it, under Sir Bill Cash, a team of legal experts, to go through the bill with a fine-tooth comb when it is published, and I'm sure they'll look at the treaty too, with the objective of ascertaining whether or not the bill fully respects parliamentary sovereignty and whether it contains unambiguous language that would allow flights to take off to Rwanda. That is what the Star Chamber will do, and they'll do that in days rather than weeks.
And you're doing it because you don't trust the government to do a bill that's appropriate?
Well, we want to understand the effect of the bill. This is complex legal stuff, so we're very fortunate to have access to some of the best lawyers in the country. They will go through it and they will explain to us in layman's English exactly what the bill legally does and does not do. And the reason it's so important is unless the bill has what's called a notwithstanding clause, in other words, one that says, in these particular circumstances, in the boats in the Channel scenario, the ECHR won't apply, then unfortunately the bill is likely to be ineffective.
Do you think this matters to ordinary people?
Absolutely. I was out canvassing in my patch on Saturday morning, got pretty nippy for 2 hours. This was the #1 issue on the doorstep. Beyond any other. I spoke to one guy and he summed it up very well. He said, look, I don't understand all the technical legalities of this. That's what I elect people like you for. But do whatever you've got to do to get these flights off to Rwanda so we can stop these boats coming over here. That summed up what my constituents were telling me again and again for 2 hours.
Do you think the PM, Mr. Sunak, gets that anger about this issue?
Well, he said unambiguously we must stop the boats. But we haven't yet. So, you know, if you're going to will the ends, you have to will the means. So we need watertight legislation. We had the Nationalities and Borders Act, that didn't do it. We had the Illegal Immigration Act, that didn't do it. This is kind of, from the public's point of view, 3 strikes and you're out.
And just finally, Mark-Francois, you're a veteran, aren't you, of the Brexit wars. How big a crisis is this week for the Tory party if it goes wrong? I do sense it's bubbling up into quite a week.
I think there's a lot of pent-up frustration on the backbenches about this. The party has promised our constituents they're going to stop the boats. We need legislation that will do that. And we also need time to scrutinise it before we vote on it. There's a strong convention in the Commons that you get a week between a bill being published and having to vote on it. The government would be very unwise to try and bounce Parliament on what is undoubtedly going to be controversial legislation.
There you have it, Andrew and Bev. A warning from Mark-Francois, the chairman of the European Research Group of Tory MPs. Don't bounce us into agreeing a bill that won't work. I've been around a bit and I think this could be a really big week for the Tory party. Back to you.
Look at the beautiful weather there in Westminster this morning.
Yeah, not a very nice atmosphere there, though, I can tell you.
No.
Febrile is the mood, I would say, in the Tory party.
Is that right?
Yeah, febrile. Good
well,
word.
It might not get any better today because it's the COVID inquiry and Boris Johnson is there. Let's go live outside with GBNews presenter Pip Thompson. Good morning, Pip. If people are just switching on, what is this module today? What are we expecting?
Good morning to you both. Well, Boris Johnson is due to give evidence. He will be put under the microscope by leading counsel to the inquiry, Hugo Keith Casey, in about 15 minutes' time. He arrived here, I think we can show you the pictures. He arrived a full 3 hours ahead of his appearance at about 7 o'clock this morning. It might have been to avoid the growing numbers of people who have been gathering and, well, us lot the media as well. I just want to actually show you the scene, what it's like here outside the building in Paddington. There are numerous photographs of people who died during COVID. Many of their families have been here. I think they're now queuing or have already made their way into the building. And then just over my left shoulder, this truck turned up as well with an allegation about what Boris Johnson did say or didn't say during lockdown. And also behind my cameraman Paul, there's banners that have even been put on the side of the pedestrian crossings as well. So it is a hugely anticipated appearance by Boris Johnson. He's going to be here for a full 2 days giving evidence. Families say they want accountability, not weak apologies. Will they get it? We'll bring you the latest here on GB News.
Thank you, Pip Thompson there at the Quarry, just around the corner from here, actually. We're joined in the studio by the leader of the Reform Party, Richard Tice, and former editor of Labour-list, Peter Edwards. Good morning, gentlemen.
Morning.
Richard, we can see the crowds there. People who lost loved ones with COVID-19 rightly feel that Boris Johnson had a responsibility to keep their loved ones safe. I personally think that is a bit of a fallacy, and it's a bit much to say that Boris Johnson's responsibility was to stop those people from
It was
dying.
an impossible situation. There were no good answers, no easy choices. But this inquiry is a complete disaster from start to finish, because it's all about gotcha moments.
Yeah.
The KC, Hugo Keith, he's acting like a journalist in the most sort of just grungy little way, just digging and niggling away. What they're not asking are the simple, impartial, independent questions. And it's actually incredibly simple. What was the data that you were presented with, as you've just touched on? Was lockdown the right thing to do or not? If it was the right thing to do, was the timing right or not? Those are the simple answers. And then you look at when should we have come out and what are the lessons you learn from that. It's incredibly simple. This thing is going to take years and years. And here's what's going on. Gove and the former Prime Minister Boris Johnson talking about the origin of the virus. That is a very serious question, required for a completely separate inquiry. This is a dead cat distraction from the two of them for the mistakes that they made. And that's what I think. It's a very serious question where it came from, but don't distort this inquiry about the decisions they made at the centre of government and whether or not they were the right decisions. And you've got to do it in a sort of truth and reconciliation way, not a gotcha way, he said, she said. You know, actually, we've all got to be grown-ups about this, learn the lessons and learn them sharpish. Sweden finished their inquiry almost 2 years ago, cost them less than 10 million quid, right? And they've learned this. Frankly, scrap this whole inquiry, read the Swedish summary, job done.
Because do you think there should be a time limit on this? Because Arlene Foster's coming on the programme a little later. She told me before we came on air, she's giving evidence in April and May next year, and I thought, April and May next year? And then it's going to go on for another couple of years after that.
I've been saying all year that this should have had a time limit of a year.
Yeah.
We're now faced the situation, I'm going to be talking about it later, scrap it or bin the barrister leading it and the chair and start again.
Yeah.
Because we know where they're coming from.
Or have it in a very timely... I mean, this is serious. This is costing hundreds of millions of taxpayers' cash.
Yeah.
It's going to take years. We're not going to learn the lessons, and it's an establishment stitch-up and cover-up. And frankly, it's infuriating.
So I don't disagree with anything you've said there, Richard, but so who is responsible, Peter, for saying this had to go ahead? This is a civil service exercise again, isn't it, to hang the Tories out to dry, maybe?
No, I think I disagree with all of that. And like Richard said, this is a government choice, or there's cross-party support to have an inquiry. Clearly, it is going on for a very long time, and I think it's...
Do you think it's for too long?
I'm not sure what the end point is. You might know.
Well, they're talking about 2026, 2027. We're now in 2023.
To me, that's too far, and that's that old phrase about justice delayed, justice denied. If you're a bereaved family member, you want to know what happened. But I think...
Whether you're bereaved by COVID or by lockdowns.
Yeah, hold on. You didn't interrupt Richard, right? So let me try and answer the question. Richard says there are gotcha moments. I think it's the absolute antithesis of that. We have a very slow-moving inquiry. We're all talking about how slow-moving it is. It's methodical. And it could either say, do we only look at stats and numbers, or do we look at the quality and transparency of decision-making? Well, of course we look at the transparency of decision-making. And then I was very concerned by what Richard says when he says, Richard is a serving politician, although not one in the House of Commons, saying we've got a public inquiry backed by the government, which is elected by the people, and we should sack the barristers because he doesn't like them. And it's wrong to behave like journalists, but journalists and barristers both have a job of asking questions.
He's got a clear biased agenda, Peter. I'm sorry. He's trying to target Brexit.
And then when I criticise that, Richard shouts me down.
No, but look...
Well, you're here to have a debate.
Have an independent analysis, Peter. It's not to act like a gotcha journalist. There's a key difference.
But it's going on for years. How can it be a gotcha moment if we have a methodical inquiry that's so slow we all complain about the duration of it?
But this is the point. I mean, like so much of the last 3 years, there is huge amounts of money being made out of this drama and continuing now with the lawyers. And if somebody in government had had more sense, they would have said, right, we have a time limit on it. But it's in everybody's interest to drag it out. You can see that, surely. This is a sham,
you know,
at the taxpayers' expense.
We've all, for various reasons, sat in court at different points in our lives. It's a judge that runs the court. Just because a barrister or a King's Counsel earns fees They have no say in the duration. It's down to the judge. The judge runs a court.
How long do you think it should go on for?
To me, as a layman, I'm neither a barrister or a medical professional. I'm against making up I'm against making up an arbitrary deadline, but I do think there should be an end point.
Yes.
Because I think that focuses mind and that delivers justice for the families. But for me as a layman to say, well, it should be 14 months, but not 13,
but Peter,
I'd have no evidence to that at all.
Peter, how come Sweden has done it already?
I've no idea. I do prepare to come on the show, but looking at the Swedish legal system is a bit of an arcane one for me to research.
Hang on, it's a European country. They went through COVID like we did. They've done their inquiry.
They didn't lock down,
and they didn't.
I think it started earlier. Is that right?
Yes, it did. But it didn't. It didn't take a year. And
it's the difference between a well-run country and a badly run country. They set up their inquiry within a few months of COVID starting. They set the terms of reference in parallel. They run their country properly. That's the difference.
I think there's a legitimate question to be said of the British political system more broadly, that inquiries are very slow, and often they're over deeply serious and distressing matters that absolutely deserve public scrutiny, like child sex abuse or both Hillsborough and the horrific aftermath for the families. But it goes back to that point that justice delayed is justice denied.
We just need to ask you, want to bring in the junior doctors. This is the biggest strike in the history of the NHS, just before Christmas for its time. The cynicism is breathtaking. There have been WhatsApp messages that have been seen with doctors laughing, we can have a longer Christmas holiday.
Yeah, I mean, it's just appalling. And I think whatever public sympathy they had, and many would say that they did justifiably have some cause, but I think they are losing it absolutely in spades. To do it just before Christmas and just into the most dangerous time of the year, when elderly people, vulnerable people are most likely to suffer, and these people who go on strike, they should be ashamed of themselves. It's nothing short of disgusting what they're doing.
Peter, you're going to condemn the strike?
No, they are exercising their legal rights.
For a 35% pay rise.
Christmas, when people are most vulnerable?
For a 35% pay rise, Peter?
Well, they'll never get that.
Well, why are they striking for it then?
Because they have, to me, that is too hard-line a negotiating position, and neither of the parties that can win the general election, Labour or Tory, have supported that, so they won't get 35%. The criticism of the government has been that they were too gung-ho in negotiations, or they'd offer negotiations without anything to do with money, which is kind of pointless.
So you support the timing of this strike?
No, because I don't want to see a strike at all.
So they should call it off?
No, I think they should negotiate. But I'd make another point. Having been on strike myself as a journalist, a member of the NUJ, as I was in a former life, Andrew, I don't know if you were.
No,
but,
never been in the NUJ.
People take industrial action because they care about the public they're serving. So I was just a newspaper journalist. That's clearly not on the same level as saving lives. But you take industrial action because you care about your readers and a product. Doctors take industrial action because they care about the health service and their patients.
And they also care about how much money they're making themselves.
Don't care about the
well, I think
they wouldn't be going on strike.
Well, hold on. I don't think you can say they don't care about the patients.
If they care about the patients, they wouldn't do it at Christmas and New Year, the most vulnerable time of the year.
Peter, Richard, thank you so much for kicking us off. So, as we've said, the former Prime Minister is going to address the COVID inquiry in the next few minutes. Do not go anywhere. This is Britain's Newsroom on GB News, the People's Channel.
A brighter outlook with Box Solar, sponsors of weather on GB News.
Good morning, welcome to your latest GB News weather update from the Met Office. It'll be a dry and bright day for many of us, but it still feel rather cold after the chilly start. But later on, we'll see some rain arriving in the west. Now, there's an ice warning in force still through the morning across northeastern areas of Scotland. And elsewhere, though, we'll see plenty of dry and clear weather through much of the day. Any freezing fog should slowly lift and clear further south and west, but the sunshine will start to turn a little bit hazier across western parts of the UK, and rain will arrive into Northern Ireland. Temperatures will start to rise, though, highs of 12 degrees in the Scilly Isles later, still feeling very cold in the east, however, despite the sunshine. And then that rain through tonight will push further east. We've got weather warnings in force for parts of Northern Ireland overnight, and then tomorrow morning into parts of the southwest of the UK. That could bring some hill snow to parts of the Pennines and Scotland for a time, but mostly we'll be seeing a lot of heavy rain. Temperatures as a result will slowly start to rise, so there's much less of a risk of a frost through tonight. And then through Thursday, the rain really does continue, so quite a damp, cloudy day, and with weather warnings in force through much of the day across parts of Scotland and these western areas. Many of us will see rain on and off throughout the day. There could be water lingering on the roads as well, so do take care if you're travelling throughout Thursday. Later on, though, in the west, we will see the sunshine return and temperatures rising into double digits for many of us. I'll see you later.
That warm feeling inside from Boxed Boilers, sponsors of weather on GB News.
Well, thanks, Annie. Any minute now, the big moment you've all been waiting for. Boris Johnson will take centre stage at last at the COVID inquiry. Stay tuned, because you don't want to miss it.
Who is it? We're here for the show. Welcome to the Dinosaur Hour with me, John Cleese. I was married to a therapist. And you survived? I thought we were getting Hugh Laurie. Second best. You interviewed Saddam Hussein. What's that like? I was terrified. I'm playing strip poker with you three. Oh!
No, thank you.
My CDs need to be put in alphabetical order.
Are you going to be problematic again?
The Dinosaur Hour. Sundays on GB News.
Good afternoon, Britain.
Good afternoon, Britain. Join us, Tom and Emily,
To find out what's happening in the heart of Westminster.
and why it matters to you.
Weekdays from midday, we bring you the most compelling stories from across the United Kingdom.
And from your doorstep to our inbox.
That's right, we want to hear from you.
GB News,
Britain's news channel.
I think the most exciting bit for me is talking to people.
People who I think are ignored often by the major news channels. We're going to give news they want to hear. There's a voice there that needs to be heard. I think there's a chance here for a diversity of opinion to be expressed, which you don't find elsewhere. It's really exciting.
We don't hold back. We're free to say how decisions that are taken here
affects us all around the country. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Michelle Dewberry, and I'm not here to tell you what to think. I'd much rather hear what you have to say. So send in your opinions to gbviews@gbnews.com. Keep them clean, and you never know, I might read them out. With my panel here on Jubes & Co, we debate, we get stuck into the issues of the day on a show where all views are welcome, especially yours. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
In the GB Newsroom, we bring you the news as it happens. With our team of dedicated journalists across the UK, we're ready to give you accurate reporting every day. When the news breaks, we'll be there with bulletins on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Your weekend starts here with Friday Night Live with me, Mark Dolan, 8 till 9 on GB News. Big stories, big guests and big laughs as we get you ready for a cracking weekend. That's Friday Night Live with Mark Dolan, Fridays 8 till 9 on GB News. Bring your own drinks, the admission's free.
GB News, unlike other broadcasters, isn't obsessed with the London-Westminster bubble. We think there's a nation beyond the M25, and that's why we talk about the issues that matter across the land. Join me on State of the Nation, 8 to 9 o'clock, Monday to Thursday, on GB News. Daisy's listening, and you should too.
Tired of the usual focus-tested, pre-prepared Westminster runaround? Well, so am I.
So you want higher taxes?
Is your department to blame for this? Are you rethinking this policy? Every Sunday at 9:30, I'll be sitting down with those in power to get the truth about the issues affecting you.
Let's be honest, we've known about the cost pressures of this project for years, not months.
That's the Camilla Tominey Show, a politics show with personality. On GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Michelle Dewberry, and I'm not here to tell you what to think. I'd much rather hear what you have to say. So send in your opinions to gbviews@gbnews.com. Keep them clean, and you never know, I might read them out. With my panel here on Jubes & Co, we debate, we get stuck into the issues of the day on a show where all views are welcome, especially yours. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Well, the former Prime Minister Boris Johnson is at the COVID inquiry. He's going to be speaking any moment now.
That's right. We're joined in the studio by the former First Minister of Northern Ireland, Dame Arlene Foster. Arlene, good to see you. We were just chatting.
Baroness Arlene
I was going to say, did I? Sorry.
She's been promoted.
Arlene.
She's a Dame and a Baroness.
Oh, I'm sorry.
What's best?
Oh, they're both pretty nice.
Yeah.
To be fair.
We were just chatting, weren't we? And actually, you reminded me that you've already given evidence at the COVID inquiry once, and you will be again in the spring. What was it like on the first occasion?
Well, you know, it is quite intense, and I always have to remember that there are people who lost loved ones during COVID. Not only to COVID, and we were just speaking about this, people who weren't diagnosed with cancer early enough and so died earlier, people who really took upon themselves mental health difficulties because of COVID, isolated. The thing I'm most concerned about, and I've already said this on the record, are our young people and the fact that we closed schools in the fashion that we did. And interestingly, there was a study just yesterday about the fact that we have fallen behind again because of the fact that our schools were closed. And we'd made gains in relation to literacy and mathematics. And we've fallen back now because of that. And I mean, those are the sorts of things I would like the inquiry to focus on, actually. What are the lessons to be learned from closing schools, from isolating our older people and not allowing them the quality of life in their last days? Those are the sorts of things I would like to look at.
And was it, how difficult a decision was it for you to close down schools in Northern Ireland?
It was incredibly difficult. Incredibly. I mean, I've always said I've been through some difficult times in politics in Northern Ireland, but I would easily say COVID was the most difficult time. Making decisions about closing down economies, pushing people into their homes, not allowing them to mix with other people socially. And in Northern Ireland, when somebody passes away, we have a very good tradition, I think, to help with grieving, of going to people's houses, going to wakes, socialising together before the funeral. All of that was stripped away. And actually, it has caused real difficulty, I think, that people were very much alone when they lost loved ones, very isolated. And, you know, there were horrific stories of old gentlemen standing beside the grave of their wives on their own during funerals. Terrible. It was a really terrible time, awful time. But look, we were all terrified out of our minds when this thing came along. And of course mistakes were made. And those mistakes will be reflected, I think, by Boris today as well.
And were you basing your decisions on the science that was coming out of Number 10?
Yes, we were getting the same sage advice, and then our own Chief Medical Officer, Chief Scientific Advisor in Northern Ireland was interpreting that for us in the executive in Northern Ireland.
And was there much pushback against lockdown?
No, because again, especially in the first lockdown, I think everybody was so frightened, and we were getting predictions of thousands of people dying and setting up temporary morgues and all of this sort of thing. I mean, we were really scared.
But was there a lack of scepticism?
Oh, yes.
Was there a lack? I mean, you know, when you look back now and you think those initial images that came out of China of people face planting at the train station in China, pure Chinese propaganda, welding up doors in hazmat suits, just trying to let the West think this is going to bring you down. It's going to bring you down. It almost did. We're still recovering from it. There was a lack of cynicism about that propaganda.
There was, and of course we'd seen the images from Italy, Northern Italy. You remember those with people dying on the hospital trolleys and what have you. And I think people.
I think that's what spooked the government most.
Yeah, I think it was too. And then I don't think there was enough scrutiny in terms of the harms that lockdown caused. But that's with hindsight, because at the time it seemed to be the only thing that we could do to protect our citizens. And I hope the inquiry does look at what we should have been looking at. We've already looked at the preparedness module. You know, were we ready for something like this? And there are obviously gaps there, I think, that will be identified. But now we're coming to the rollout of the lockdown, and that's what Boris will be talking about today.
One of the, I mean, Rishi will be on the spot about this. He was Chancellor of the Exchequer. There was all the modelling about impacts on health and mental health, but was there any modelling on the impact on the economy? And if not, why not?
Yeah, well, initially, I don't think there. We certainly weren't looking at the impact on the economy, and people. When you even raise the impact on the economy,
uncaring.
The media was sort of, you're picking our well-being and our survival over the economy. So what about the economy? And my response to that at the time, which wasn't really very welcome by a lot of the media in Northern Ireland, was the fact that actually people need a job for their mental health to keep their families going. If you're losing your business, if your business is going down as well, then that's going to have an impact on you as well. Never mind catching COVID. So Yeah, it's a very difficult time. I think Boris will probably want to reflect that he believed he took the right decisions. However, it'll be for the inquiry then to come up with their answers.
Hugo Keith KC was in shot.
Boris Johnson just being sworn in. He's got the Bible in his right hand. If you're listening on the radio, he looks like he's combed his hair.
Barely.
He's smartly dressed. He's got his tie on. He's sitting down, and Hugo Keith will ask the first question, and the grandstanding, in my view, will begin.
Evidence, please, by giving us your full name.
Alexander Boris Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson. Thank you for attending today and for the provision of your witness statement 255836. It's dated the 31st of August, as you know, and it contains the usual declaration as to the truth of its contents on the final page, I think page 233. Mr. Johnson, you were, of course, Prime Minister between the 24th of July 2019, when you were invited to form an administration following the resignation of Theresa May, MP, as leader of the Conservative Party, and the 6th of September 2022, you having announced your resignation earlier that year on the 7th of July. Is that correct?
Yes, it is, Mr. Keith. By your leave, my lady, can I just say how glad I am to be at this inquiry, and how sorry I am for the pain and the loss and the suffering
Sit down.
of
Please stop.
COVID victims.
Please sit down. Please sit down, or I'm afraid you'll have to leave the hearing room. I'm sorry, if you don't sit down, I'm going to ask the ushers to get you to leave. Right, ushers, please, could you ask them to leave?
Could I say, by your leave, that I understand the feelings of these victims and their families, and I am deeply sorry for the pain and the loss and the suffering of those victims and their families. And grateful though I am to the hundreds of thousands of healthcare workers and many other public servants and people in all walks of life who helped to protect our country throughout a dreadful pandemic, I do hope that this inquiry will help to get the answers to the very difficult questions that those victims and those families are rightly asking, so that we can protect ourselves better, help each other to help protect ourselves better in the future and prevent further suffering. And if it's not too impertinent, may I say, as the person, as you rightly say, Mr. Keith, who set up this inquiry, how grateful I am to you for what you're doing and for the immense care that you are plainly taking.
Thank you.
Mr. Johnson, just a few more questions more, please, in relation to your career. On the 9th of June 2023, did you announce your intention to stand down as the Member of Parliament for Uxbridge and South Ruislip? You then, I think, formally resigned the following Monday, the 12th of June, when you were appointed Steward and Bailiff of the 300s of Chiltern. You were, of course, previously Foreign Secretary and Mayor of London. You correctly observe that you yourself announced the institution of this statutory inquiry on the 12th of May 2021. You ordered the institution of a full and independent public inquiry, did you not?
I did, Mr. Keith, and I believe that's the right way forward.
When you made that announcement, you said this: amid such tragedy, the state has an obligation to examine its actions as rigorously and candidly as possible. The number of deaths across the United Kingdom, calculated whether by registration on the death certificate through COVID or the measure of excess deaths, is now over 230,000. By any measure, Mr. Johnson, that is a shocking figure and a terrible loss of life. Is that the tragedy to which you were referring when you said, in this tragedy, the state has an obligation to examine its actions?
That is certainly the core of the tragedy, yes.
Do you agree that if the protection of life is the preeminent duty that every government owes to its citizens, then the number of those who died is an important, if not the most important, marker against which your administration be measured?
I certainly think it was what we were trying to prevent, was the loss of life, absolutely.
The virus left in its wake, of course, not just death, but injury and misery, and indirectly through the lockdowns, it left pain and incalculable economic and societal damage. Were those and are those impacts which you also envisaged this inquiry would look at when you audited its institution?
Of course.
Do you accept, and we may, I think, presume from your opening remarks that you do you accept that the bereaved and those who suffered, of whom there are very many a number, are entitled to no less than an absolutely full and rigorous scrutiny?
Of course.
When you made that announcement, you also said that this process will place the state's actions under the microscope, and the government would be required to disclose all relevant information. In light of those words, could I just ask you, please, to confirm what your approach has been to the disclosure of your own COVID-related emails, WhatsApps and notes?
I've done my best to give everything of any conceivable relevance.
Has that always been your position, Mr. Johnson?
Yes.
Could we have 265619, please, page 68? This is a WhatsApp between your former Permanent Secretary Number 10 and then latterly Cabinet Secretary and your principal private secretary, Simon Case, and respectively Martin Reynolds. And the Cabinet Secretary said the Prime Minister is mad if he doesn't think his WhatsApps will become public via the COVID inquiry. He was clearly not in the mood for that discussion tonight. That date, the 20th of December 2021, was just 5 days after you had in fact appointed Milady as the chair of this inquiry. Was there a debate at that time within government as to whether or not your WhatsApps should be disclosed? And if so, whether or not they would become public by virtue of their disclosure in this process?
I don't remember the conversation to which the Cabinet Secretary is referring, and I've handed over all the relevant WhatsApps.
The inquiry has indeed requested all the key COVID-related texts, WhatsApps and so on from January 20 to February 22, and it must be made absolutely clear that throughout the course of the litigation in the summer and throughout these proceedings, you have made available, it would seem, everything in your possession. You made clear, I think, through your solicitors, however, that you had a phone which you used from May 2021, and you've made available the WhatsApps and the emails from that phone. Therefore, between May 21 and February 22, the end of the period that the inquiry was requesting about. But following a well-publicised security breach, you had not been able to use to access the previous phone because you'd stopped using it, and you were fearful that if you tried to access it, you'd delete its data. Is that right?
That's right.
Were you able to get access ultimately to the contents of that first phone, the old phone?
Yes, so we sent it off to some technical people and they activated it.
Was there a time gap, as your solicitors have described it, on that phone, a period between the 30th of January 2020 and June 2020, during which time the WhatsApps have not been capable of being reinstalled and disclosed.
That's right.
Do you know why your phone was missing those 5,000 odd WhatsApps?
I don't know the exact reason, but it looks as though it's something to do with the app going down and then coming up again, but somehow not automatically erasing all the things between that date when it went down and the moment when it was last backed up. So I can't give you the technical explanation, but that's the best I'm able to give.
The technical report that your solicitors kindly provided demonstrates that there may have been a factory reset of the phone at the end of January 2020 and then an attempt to reinstall the contents later in June 2020. May I just ask you this? Was it you, if that was a factory reset that was done, was it you that tried to reset the phone or not?
A factory reset?
There is a device or a capability on the phone which allows its contents to be entirely reset. That wasn't you.
I don't remember any such thing.
All right. And during the course of the litigation this summer between the inquiry and the Cabinet Office, did you, of course, make plain your stated wish that the WhatsApps which were the subject of that litigation should be disclosed?
Yes.
They being your own WhatsApps. All right.
Can I, for the avoidance of doubt, make it absolutely clear I haven't removed any WhatsApps from my phone, and I've given you everything that I think you need.
I asked Mr. Johnson because this issue has been trailed in the press.
Yeah, no, I get you.
And it's important that you have an opportunity of explaining why those WhatsApps are not available. In your witness statement, at paragraph 10, you say, Mr. Johnson, that unquestionably mistakes were made. And for those, you say you unreservedly apologise. We have the statement there. I'd like you, please, to set out in broad terms, of course we'll be looking at the detail of it later, but in broad terms, what mistakes you refer to there. Bearing in mind that we are only concerned in this module, Mr. Johnson, with the core decision-making, with the lockdown decisions, the NPIs, the non-pharmaceutical interventions and so on, not vaccines, therapeutics, antivirals. Okay. What mistakes do you unquestionably accept were made?
Well, I think if you look at my statement, I point out that we were relying so much on messaging to help contain the virus, and we needed the public to understand the message in as straightforward a way as possible, and they really did, by and large. One problem we had that I mention is that because of the very natural and proper right of the devolved administrations to have their own approach, sometimes there was a bit of so the BBC News would have one message from number 10, then a slightly different one from Scotland or wherever, and that I think we need to sort that out in future. And I'm sure there are plenty of other things that we could have done differently, but I have no doubt it will come to them in the course of the examination.
So your position today is, and you appear to refer to it as the first issue, that the primary mistake made rests in the context of the messaging and the communications with the devolved administration.
Well, you asked me to cite a mistake that we made. I didn't say that was the primary mistake.
What primary mistakes, Mr. Johnson, are you referring to in paragraph 10 when you say there was terrible suffering, but in relation to which, where we failed, I apologise again? For what are you apologising in that statement?
Well, I think just to go back to your main point, which is that so many people suffered, so many people lost their lives. Inevitably, in the course of trying to handle a very, very difficult pandemic in which we had to balance appalling harms on either side of the decision, we may have have made mistakes. I don't want to try to anticipate the discussion, which I'm sure we will get into, about the timings of MPIs, of lockdowns. Inevitably, we got some things wrong. I think we were doing our best at the time, given what we knew, given the information I had available to me at the time. I think we did our level best. Were there things that we should have done differently? Unquestionably, but I would struggle to itemize them all before you now in a hierarchy. I'm afraid. I think it would be. I'd find it easier to try and explain what happened as we went through.
You say in your witness statement, I unquestionably made mistakes. Can you draw a distinction for us, please, between yourself personally and the government? To what extent do you accept personal responsibility as opposed to accepting it on behalf of your administration?
So I take personal responsibility for all the decisions that we made.
It's obvious, Mr. Johnson, that many of the most difficult and momentous decisions rested upon your own shoulders as Prime Minister. Do you take responsibility for whatever my lady makes of the speed of the government's response in January, February, March of 2020?
Of course.
And the way in which the various moving parts of the government, the advisory committees, the departments, the agencies and so on responded?
Of course.
Do you take responsibility for the lockdown decisions, whichever way they went, and their timeliness, whatever my lady makes of them? The manner in which patients were discharged from hospitals into the care sector?
Of course.
The explosion of the virus within the residential care sector?
Yes.
The general speed at which the restrictions were eased?
Yes.
The Eat Out to Help Out scheme? And then, latterly in 2020, the decision not to introduce a circuit breaker in September or October, or to introduce a tier system earlier when the prevalence of the virus was lower, for good or ill.
Yes, though we did have local restrictions from a very early day.
Did. May I just ask you, please, this question? Also, you refer to mistakes. It's very important that the inquiry understands to what extent it's accepted that there were mistakes, as opposed to an acceptance that, with hindsight, the government could have done better. Do you mean there were failings, things or decisions that you got avoidably wrong, whether because they were the wrong decisions or because your management and leadership meant that the right decisions were less likely to be taken? Or do you mean, with hindsight, you just could have done better?
Well, that's a sort of deterministic question, isn't it?
Well, it's an important one.
I think the answer is that with hindsight, it may be easy to see things that we could have done differently, or it may be possible to see things that we could have done differently. At the time, I felt, and I know that everybody else felt, that we were doing our best in very difficult circumstances to protect life and protect the NHS.
It is impossible and arguably improper to attribute any individual death causally to any particular governmental decision, and as I know you know, and no possible purpose would be served in such an exercise. But do you accept that overall the government decision-making, not the pandemic, but the government decision-making in response, led materially to there being a greater number of excess deaths in the United Kingdom than might otherwise have been the case?
I can't give you the answer to that question. I'm not sure. I noticed that in your opening preamble a few months ago, you produced a slide saying that the UK was, I think, second only to Italy for excess deaths.
Correct.
That's not, to the best of my knowledge, the case. And I think that all I would say is that many other countries suffered terrible losses from COVID.
They did.
And the evidence that I've seen suggests that we were well down the European table and well down the world table. Though that is, of course, no comfort to the bereaved and their families. That seems to be the statistical reality.
The evidence before Milady is that the United Kingdom had one of the highest rates of excess death in Europe. Almost all other Western European countries had a lower level of excess death.
I've seen.
Italy was tragically in a worse position than the United Kingdom.
Well, I don't wish to contradict you, Mr. Keith, but the evidence, the ONS data I saw put us, I think, about 16th or 19th in a table of 33.
In Western Europe, we were one of the worst off, if not the second worst off. You must have long reflected since that time why that was so. Why do you think that we had the rate of excess deaths in this country that we did ultimately have?
As I say, I think that the statistics vary, and I think that every country struggled with a new pandemic, and I think the UK, from the evidence that I have seen, was well down the European table and obviously even further down the world table. If I had to answer why I think we faced particular headwinds, I would say it was irrespective of government action. We have an elderly population, extremely elderly population. We do suffer, sadly, from lots of COVID-related comorbidities. And we are a very, very densely populated country, the second most densely populated country in Europe, and that did not help.
Do you accept that government actions materially contributed to that outcome? It wasn't just a matter of the state of the healthcare system, density, age of population, and in fact, the geographical location of the United Kingdom.
Given that other countries have excellent healthcare systems and face similar problems and ended up in statistically with more excess deaths per 100,000, the answer is I don't know. I don't know.
You're obviously extremely well aware of the argument that the lockdown decisions themselves, cumulatively and individually, contributed to the number of excess deaths. What do you say to that?
I say that I don't know, but I'm aware of the arguments that are made. What I would say respectfully to people is that they were very, very difficult decisions, and the issue of the timeliness of lockdowns was clearly one that we considered very hard at the time, and you will have seen from the evidence that there were strong arguments against going too early into lockdowns, especially when it came to that first series of March NPIs. And you'll remember the arguments that were made, two arguments against early action, and they were the risk of behavioural fatigue and then the risk of bounce back, or what you've called uncoiling of the spring. And they were made powerfully, and they certainly had a big effect on me.
Could you assist the inquiry, please, with something about the nature of the heavy responsibility which rested on your shoulders? It is perhaps self-evident that only the most difficult and momentous decisions come for the Prime Minister.
That's correct.
Were there any good or easy decisions to be made in this context?
No, I can't think of a single. Well, I suppose it was an easy decision to say that we should go ahead with the rollout of both Pfizer and AstraZeneca as soon as they've been approved by the MHRA. But there were no, when it came to the, forgive me, Mr. Keith, but when it came to the balancing of the need to protect the public and protect the NHS and the damage done by lockdowns, it was incredibly difficult.
Pause there, please. I do understand emotions are running very high. I do, and I think it's most unfortunate when I have to ask people to leave. But we have to ensure that this hearing is effective, and it's got to be effective not just for people in this hearing room, but for people watching on the online streaming. So please make sure your behaviour is appropriate to a public hearing of a statutory inquiry. Thank you. Sorry to interrupt.
No, it's fine.
We'll look at the nature of the particular decisions in greater detail later. But broadly speaking, so that we know the lie of the land and we know how you approach these issues, were the majority of the most momentous decisions, the decisions, for example, to impose the lockdowns and social distancing measures and so on, were they decisions that were in practice made by you, yes, even if they were affirmed or endorsed by the Cabinet later, or were they decisions that were entirely open-endedly made by Cabinet?
That's a very good question, because I think it was both. A huge number of decisions, because they had to be taken so fast, were funneled up directly to me, but there were also a large number of decisions, and I do think this maybe hasn't come out as much as it should, that were the subject of exhaustive Cabinet discussion.
In his witness statement, Michael Gove has said that the wider Cabinet was brought into decisions at times too late and too little. Mr. Javid has said in his witness statement that the Cabinet was designed, in his view, to place Dominic Cummings and the Prime Minister as the decision makers, to centralise power in number 10. And in his own witness statement, Mr. Cummings has said that the Cabinet was largely irrelevant to policy or execution on account of the leaks, your inability to chair it, and because it was seen by number 10 as not being a serious place for serious discussion.
I don't think that's true. I think there were some really excellent Cabinet discussions about the trade-offs. If I had to make a comment about Cabinet as a whole in terms of the speed of lockdowns, which was what we're talking about, I think it probably would be fair to say that the Cabinet was, on the whole, more reluctant to impose MPIs than necessarily than I was. That wasn't true for every member of the Cabinet, but that would be a general comment.
The lockdown decision of the 23rd of March 2020 was debated, as you rightly say, at great length on the Sunday, on the Monday by the various bodies, but in particular COBRA. But it was debated in COBRA on Monday the 23rd. A public announcement, we'll all recall, was made that day, that evening in fact, and then it went to Cabinet on the Tuesday. So in relation to the first lockdown decision, it's obvious that Cabinet debated it after the event. In relation to the second lockdown, that of November 2020, Mr. Johnson, do you recall whether or not that decision was made by a COVID ministerial committee or by Cabinet?
I'm afraid I can't remember the sequence there, but just picking you up on the first lockdown, which was actually a sort of crescendo of measures, I'm fairly certain we had a long Cabinet call at least to discuss it.
Well, we'll look at that in detail later. The inquiry's heard a great deal of evidence, Mr. Johnson, about the way in which your secretaries of state would naturally and permissibly come at the same issue, whether to have a lockdown, whether to ease, whether to have a tier system and the like, from different angles. The Secretary of State for Health and Social Care, understandably, would promote the public health consequences and the need to act in the public health. The Chancellor would frequently promote the economic considerations, but all, it's obvious, were aware to greater or lesser degree of the societal and economic harm that would result from the decisions that you were having to contemplate making. Who ultimately had to weigh up and determine the competing public interest considerations, public health, societal harm, economic damage, and so on? On whose shoulders rested that debate?
That's the job of the Prime Minister, and there's only the Prime Minister that can do that. But I think that wasn't actually a bad way of doing it, to have different interests represented by different Secretaries of State and different departments.
Presumably you needed the advice of your close advisors, your Cabinet Secretary, and those in the civil service, in addition to the advice that you were receiving from your Secretaries of State. Could you give, please, the inquiry an indication as to the identity of the persons upon whom you were most reliant in that debate, in that weighing up exercise?
Well, I don't wish to embarrass distinguished public officials by naming them. I don't know what the. Well, I found that civil servants, on the whole, are quite happy to remain anonymous. But I can certainly tell you that I had superb deputy private secretary, a mathematician, an economist who's brilliant in understanding healthcare issues, and an absolutely brilliant private secretary for healthcare.
The inquiry's obviously heard from a number of advisors.
I think you've heard from both of those individuals.
So there's no debate about their identity, Mr. Johnson, and no risk.
You may need to make the question a bit more specific, Mr. Keith.
The evidence is, Mr. Johnson, that you received advice from advisors in number 10.
Yes.
Obviously, your chief advisor, Mr. Cummings.
Yes.
You received advice from the Cabinet Secretary. Firstly,
yes,
Mark Sedwell, and then latterly Simon Case. You received advice from the CMO,
yes,
and then the General Chief Scientific Advisor.
Yes, sorry, I should have cited them first. Yes.
It's apparent that on top of the formal advisory structures, the meetings with the CMO and the GCSA, the meetings with the Cabinet Secretary, the meetings with your ministers, you had a profusion of meetings with your Chief Advisor, Mr. Cummings, with your Cabinet Secretary, with your Principal Private Secretary, and so on. There were a huge number of rolling meetings with your innermost group of advisors. And I want to know to what extent, therefore, you came to rely upon them in the ultimate decision-making process.
I, of course, relied on the advice I was given, but the way it works is advisors advise and ministers decide, and that was what happened.
You received a great deal of advice from the Chief Medical Officer and yes, the government's scientific chief advisor. They were a vital source of advice, yes, that's obvious. You were aware that SAGE met hundreds of times, that's to say the Scientific Advisory Group for Emergencies. Did you ever read their minutes, or were you wholly reliant on the CMO and the GCSA to relay to you what SAGE had said?
I think I did once or twice look at or maybe more than that. I looked at what SAGE had actually said, and SAGE certainly produced a lot of documentation. But I think that the CSA and the CMO did an outstanding job of leading SAGE and of distilling their views and conveying them to me.
The SAGE minutes were described as consensus minutes because they were designed to be read at speed, to be able to get to the heart of the issue immediately on reading them, and to ensure that the advice that was being given would be yes, readily and speedily understood. Did you ever think of calling as a general practice for those minutes so that you could yourself read them? Many of them were only 8 or 9 pages long.
As I say, I think I did from time to time look at the consensus minutes. I think in retrospect it might have been valuable to try to hear the SAGE conversation unpasteurised itself. But I didn't. And I was more than content with the very clear summaries that I was getting from the CSA and the CMO.
There were hundreds of consensus minutes, but you read only, or were given only a fraction of them.
That sounds right to me, yes.
All right. We'll look in detail at some of the scientific debates that engage government, particularly in the middle of March. Behavioural fatigue, herd immunity, the debate about the reasonable worst-case scenario, and so on.
Yes.
Did you not think of looking at the scientific horse in the mouth and seeing what was actually being said by the government's primary scientific advisory committee on these issues when you, as now appears to be the case, you became engaged, particularly in the debate of behavioural fatigue? Why didn't you call for the primary material?
I think that's a good question. I was very, very much impressed by and dependent upon the CMO and the CSA, both of whom are outstanding experts in their field. And it felt to me that I couldn't do better than that.
The CMO and the SCA were, of course, concerned with medicine and science, and SAGE was concerned, as it says on the tin, with science.
Well, CMO is a professor of public health. I mean, he knows an awful lot about epidemiology and public behaviour in an epidemic.
He does. You had no advisory structure around you, however, and by contrast, that dealt with matters such as the economic damage that would be done by the lockdown decisions. There was no pandemic or civil emergency or societal advisory body which might be thought to be analogous to SAGE. In hindsight, and with the passage of time, do you suggest that there was an absence of a proper advisory structure to deal with the other issues and the other considerations which weighed in the balance when you came to make those final decisions?
I've thought about that a great deal, and I think in the end that there is such a body, and it's called HM Treasury, and that is what they do. And you referred earlier on, Mr. Keith, to the competing perspectives of the Whitehall departments and the secretaries of state, and I think for all its difficulties, I think it did work well in allowing me to get a balance of the argument.
The evidence appears already to suggest that the Chancellor of the Exchequer and then Her Majesty's Treasury had considerable influence over the ultimate decision-making process, because the Chancellor would come and see you in bilateral meetings. There were bilateral meetings in the week of the 16th of March, before the first lockdown decision, in late October, before the second, in the summer of 21, and then again in December of 21 in relation to Omicron, and also Eat Out to Help Out. But that advice was given to you by the Chancellor and Her Majesty's Treasury in a way that wasn't openly transparent in the way that the SAGE advice was provided to you. There were no minutes disclosed of the advice that you were being given to the public. There was no regular production of material or any kind of published, transparent economic analysis provided to you. Do you think in hindsight that that was an error?
I think that there was certainly transparent economic analysis of the cost of some of the measures that we were obliged to enact and the fall in GDP, the cost of the CJRS and the other schemes was plain for all to see. That was all public. Of course, what was not public and is not traditionally public is ministerial conversations and discussion between ministers. But again, I think the perspective that I was being offered by the Treasury was a very useful one, just as the perspective of the Department of Health was a very useful one.
The material, so that's to say diary entries and readouts of minutes and so on, Mr. Johnson, show that the Chancellor of the Exchequer would, in this difficult context of making the ultimate decisions about lockdowns and easing and tiers and so on, often get the last word by way of a bilateral meeting that would take place just before you made a final decision. And also the Secretary of State for Health and Social Care was occasionally excluded from meetings when public health matters were being discussed. Were you aware of that?
I think that's... I reject that characterisation of what took place. The overwhelming priority of the government was protect the NHS, save lives. That was our objective. And that was where my officials were coming from. That was what we wanted to do. And I think it was important in that context to, there were lots of things we had to do that were very difficult, very costly. And it was right to have endless conversations with the Treasury. This was what we did.
You know, of course, that a great deal of evidence has been given to Milady about the operation and the competence of your administration. It needs to be stated absolutely plainly that the inquiry has absolutely no interest in the salaciousness or the nature of Mr. Cummings's linguistic style or the WhatsApps. But it does have an interest, of course, in whether or not his communications revealed an abusive and misogynistic impact. The WhatsApps and the texts shed a direct light on the competence of the government, how well or not the government machinery operated, what you all thought about each other, and what some of you thought privately about the decisions that were being taken. We're going to look in detail at them later, but it's fair to say that in the round that material paints a appalling picture, not all the time, but at times of incompetence and disarray.
Can I comment on that? I think Please. That the two things need to be separated out there. I think it is certainly true that this inquiry has, and I'm glad of it, I think has dredged up a phenomenal quantity of the type of material that would never have been available to any previous inquiry into doings in Number 10, because it's WhatsApp communications of a kind that would not have been possible. And that's a good thing, because you can get a texture of the feeling for the relationships and the human beings. I would make a couple of points. First of all, a lot of the language, the style that you refer to is completely unknown to me, or indeed to anybody else not on that group. I've apologised to one particular person who suffered abuse in one of those publicised WhatsApp exchanges. But I would make a distinction between the type of language used and the decision-making processes of the government and what we got done. And I would submit that any powerful and effective government has, and I think of the Thatcher government or the Blair government, has a lot of challenging and competing characters whose views about each other might not be fit to print, but to get an awful lot done. And that's what we did.
Your own Cabinet Secretary, Mark Sedwell, he was, of course, asked to move on, and we'll come to that later, in May 2020, described, according to Sir Patrick Vallance, your administration as brutal and useless, and observed that it was hard to motivate people in Number 10 in such terrible times if they were being shot in the back. that would appear to be a reference to the doings, as you say, of Number 10, to the process and the operation of government, as opposed to the atmospherics. Would you not agree?
Again, I think that actually what you're looking at in all this this stuff is a lot of highly talented and highly motivated people who are stricken with anxiety about what is happening, about the pandemic, who are doing their best, and who, like all human beings, under great stress and great anxiety about themselves and their own performance, will be inclined to be critical of others. And I think that would have been the same of any administration facing the same sort of challenges on that scale.
But do you accept that there is a considerable body of material which addresses not just their private thoughts of the other individuals in government, of them personally, but relates to the performance of government, to the way in which your administration actually operated? Do you accept that as a general proposition?
I do, and I think that was a good and a healthy thing, because we needed, given the scale of what we were facing, we needed constantly to challenge ourselves and constantly to try to do better.
Your own chief advisor, Mr. Cummings, described on the 4th of May something the government had done as being the best success of the whole criminally incompetent government performance. How could that be a good thing?
Because what he is trying to do is not for me to explain his quotation. You can ask him yourself. But what we were generally trying to do was to make sure that we delivered the best possible service for the people of the UK who were going through an absolutely terrible, terrible time. And it would not have been right to have a load of, if we'd had a load of WhatsApps saying, aren't we doing brilliantly, folks? Isn't this going well? I think your criticisms might have been, frankly, even more pungent.
On the 27th of March, after Mr. Cummings had asserted that Whitehall had nearly killed huge numbers of people and cost millions of jobs, and that Mr. Hancock had failed to get on top of the testing problems, you yourself said these 3 words, totally fucking hopeless. That was a reference to the performance of an important part of government.
I'd stress the word nearly in that.
Your response, Mr. Johnson.
And I would say that my job was not uncritically to accept that everything we were doing was good, though I as it happens, as I said to you, I do think that the country as a whole had notable achievements during the crisis. My job was to try to get a load of quite disparate, quite challenging characters to keep going and through a long period, and to keep doing their level best to protect the country. That was my job.
Do you accept the evidence from Helen McNamara, about which you will be aware, and also from former cabinet secretaries, that Mr. Cummings himself contributed to such a toxic atmosphere that civil servants simply didn't want to work in the heart of government? Helen McNamara said the relationships in Number 10 and the Cabinet Office had a real and damaging impact. You were told directly by Simon Case on the 2nd of July, lots of top drawer people had refused to come to work because of the toxic reputation of your, I emphasize, your operation. Were you aware that there were individuals, civil servants and advisors who were not prepared to work in your administration because of the atmosphere and the working relationships which were in play?
First of all, no. Second, I was not aware of that. Secondly, I didn't see any sign of that. I saw brilliantly talented people when we advertised for a post, when we wanted to recruit for a position in my private office. We had, as far as I could see, no difficulty getting wonderful people to step forward. I think, if I might make one self-criticism, or another self-criticism, I think that the gender balance of my team should have been better. And to your earlier question, looking back at it, when I was running London, it was great and it was 50-50 and it was a very harmonious team. I think sometimes during the pandemic, too many meetings were too male-dominated, if I'm absolutely honest with you. And I think that was I tried sometimes to rectify it. I tried to recruit a former colleague from City Hall, but I think that was something we should have done better.
Simon Case, who was then the Permanent Secretary Number 10, WhatsApped you yourself on the 2nd of July to say that lots of people, lots of top drawer people had refused to come because of the toxic reputation of your operation.
Well, I don't remember that.
What did you do?
I don't remember that. And my impression was that we had no difficulty recruiting the best possible people.
Could we have, please, 48313, page 16, on the screen? These are communications between Mr. Cummings and yourself in May 2020. We're concerned with the bottom half of the page.
So can you expand it, because I can't?
Yes, 7th of May, Hancock is unfit for this job. The incompetence, the constant lies, the obsession with media bullshit. Reference to testing. You must ask him where we'll get to 500,000 per day and where's your plan for testing. And if you can scroll back out. But just, sorry, just pause a second, Mr. Johnson. If you then scroll in, please, to the bottom half of the page, the last part. Mr. Cummings says, it'll certainly be a cock-up like everything else, but it'll be far from the worst of our cock-ups over the next 8 weeks. You need to think of Binning Hancock, and so on and so forth. You cannot suggest that you are unaware of the opinion taken by your chief advisor over your Secretary of State for Health. You cannot suggest you are unaware of the concerns expressed by your Cabinet Secretary about the toxic reputation of your operation, because he WhatsApped you directly. You cannot suggest that there weren't grave concerns being expressed in date, that there were people who simply would not come and work for you because of the atmosphere you allowed to develop.
So, first of all, in politics, there's never a time when you're not, if you're Prime Minister, you are constantly being lobbied by somebody to sack somebody else. It's just what I'm afraid happens, and it's part of life. Everybody's constantly militating against some other individual for some reason of their right. It's just that I'm afraid that's the nature of it. It is perfectly true that this advisor in particular thought had a low opinion of the health secretary. I thought he was wrong. I stuck by the health secretary. I thought the health secretary worked very hard, and whatever, he may have had defects, but I thought that he was doing his best in very difficult circumstances, and I thought he was a good communicator.
Could we have 303-245? Your first and then your second Cabinet Secretary communicate by WhatsApp, page 9. Mr. Case refers at the top of the page to how you have told Mr. Cummings outright to stop talking to the media in his presence. This place is just insane, zero discipline. And then in the bottom half of the page, these people are so mad, madly self-defeating. It's hard to ask people to march. It should be to the sound of gunfire. And then the Cabinet Secretary. The Cabinet Secretary is the head of the civil service. Is he or she not? I've never seen a bunch of people less well equipped to run a country. That's not a matter of atmospherics or lobbying or part of the general day in, day out friction within government, is it?
Yes, I think it is, and I think that as I say, if you'd had the views of the Mandarinate about the Thatcher government in unexpurgated WhatsApps, milady, I think you would have found that they were pretty fruity. It's WhatsApp conversation is intended to be, though clearly it isn't, ephemeral. It tends to the pejorative and the hyperbolical, and I think that the worst vice, in my view, would have been to have had an operation where everybody was so deferential and so reluctant to make waves that they never expressed their opinion, they never challenged, and they never doubted. It was much more important to have a group of people who are willing to doubt themselves and to doubt each other. And I think that was creatively useful rather than the reverse.
Some of these senior advisors didn't just lack deference, to use your word, Mr. Johnson. They doubted you, and they doubted your ability and your competence, as you now know from having seen the material. Could we have, please, 273901, page 188? That's from the 19th of September. Page 229. There is a reference to leadership position.
Would you like me to?
Yes, I'm just going to put, because it's right and proper that, and fair that you're asked to give your response to some of the material which has been produced to this inquiry. And then page 245. The Prime Minister begins to argue for letting it all rip. They've had a good innings. And there is a reference there to lack of leadership, the last line. This all feels like a complete lack of leadership. Look, let me put the question, whether or not these significant number of advisors correctly stated the position, whether or not this was genuine, whether or not there were significant failings in your own and your government's competence, would you accept that it is extraordinary that the government's chief scientific advisor, its chief advisor, its cabinet secretaries, its deputy cabinet secretary, should all be commenting in these terms about competence and about performance and about you?
I think this is wholly to be expected, and this is a period in which we are where the country is going through a resurgence of the virus. You're looking at the October period, and Patrick, the CSA, talks about inconsistency, and we've just got to face the reality. I've got to face the reality as Prime Minister that the virus seems to be refusing to be suppressed by the measures we've used so far. We're going to need different measures. We've come out of lockdown. We're going into the tiering system. Of course we're changing, but so did the collective understanding of the science. And if you look back at what happened during COVID, we had radically different views over the period, over the efficacy of masks, over whether asymptomatic transmission could take place. We had a totally different view within months about whether ventilators would be needed. I was told to begin with we needed 25% of patients would need ventilators. That turned out not to be true. Then on this particular issue, you've got the scientists calling for us to go early and go hard, and this takes us back to your initial line of questioning. When earlier on, they had been saying expressly that if you go hard too soon, then you have two problems: behavioural fatigue and bounce back. And the problem that I was facing, and it was an appalling problem in October, was that we didn't have therapeutics, or we didn't have, well, we had some therapeutics, but we didn't have a vaccine, we didn't have a way out, a medical solution. We were being forced to use NPIs, and at this particular moment, I'm sure we'll come to the October-November lockdowns, my anxiety was that we were going to have to do the same thing over and over again. And I think what those notebooks reflect and what all those comments reflect is the deep anxiety of a group of people doing their level best who cannot see an easy solution and are naturally self-critical and critical of others.
All right. It's obvious that these things were said at the time. You say not to you, although...
So you've been listening to Boris Johnson, watching Boris Johnson giving evidence in the COVID inquiry, the former Prime Minister. He's going to be there for quite a few hours yet. He's there all day today and tomorrow. He's already made an apology. He says he's deeply sorry for the mistakes that were made. Can I just say how glad I am to be at this inquiry and how sorry I am for the pain and the loss and the suffering.
There was a protester at the start of the inquiry. The camera didn't show us who that was, but Baroness Hallett did ask for that person to be removed. We can only presume. I presume it was somebody that lost someone to COVID, because there were certainly people like that who were basically outside of the inquiry this morning, just near Paddington, with placards.
What was quite interesting, he said his cabinet was more reluctant to lock down than he was. So that rather goes against the grain of what we were expecting to hear, that he was the reluctant one.
Yeah.
And but it seems that the cabinet, he had to take that cabinet with him. That's interesting, because I thought he was the one who was arguing rather heroically, in my view, against the lockdown because of the huge impact it would have on the economy, mental health, schools, kids, all that stuff.
We're joined in the studio by Emma Webb and Stephen Pound.
No, we're going back to the inquiry.
I'm going to talk to you in a bit, guys. Sorry about this. So
we're going back to the inquiry, which is riveting.
SPADs, the system by which you receive advice from your political advisors, needs to be reformed. Have you reflected on the function and powers and the extent of the powers of SPADs, or on the competence of the ministers whose advice you accepted?
Well, I think with hindsight, there's all sorts of things that you could do differently. I think at the time, I decided that it was best to have an atmosphere of challenge with some strong characters giving me advice, and I valued that advice.
Well, with hindsight, you can now see what was going on, and you've had this material for some time. Have you reflected on whether or not the inquiry could, if my lady sees fit, make recommendations about the way in which a character such as Mr. Cummings, about whom some extremely strong views have been expressed, should be in the position that he was? Views on whether or not the Prime Minister had access to the correct and proper forms of advice? Are these not issues that you've thought about?
Yes, but I think overwhelmingly that I did have access to the correct and proper forms of advice. And if you ask upon whom I relied for that advice, it was the CMO and the CSA, together with the experts, the officials in my private office.
You lost confidence in your Cabinet Secretary in May 2020, did you not?
Well, he asked to step aside.
Did you lose confidence in your Cabinet Secretary in May 2020?
Yeah, he asked to step aside.
Did you lose confidence in your Chief Advisor, whom you described as engaging in an orgy of narcissism at the heart of your administration?
Well, I think he also stepped aside.
Did you lose confidence in those senior advisers, Mr. Johnson, and effectively dispose of them both?
Well, they both stepped aside from government, but it was a very difficult, very challenging period. People were getting, as you can see from the WhatsApps, they were getting very frazzled because they were frustrated. COVID kept coming at us in wave after wave, and it was very, very hard to fight it. And people were doing their level best. And I don't, when people are critical of the guy at the top, or they're critical of each other, that's a reflection of the difficulty of the circumstances. When it became easier in the spring and during the vaccine rollout, people's tone changed. Of course it did, but it was a reflection of the agony that the country was going through and that the government was going through.
Ladies, at a convenient moment, I'm about to turn to a completely separate topic.
Right. I shall return at 20 past.
Right, they're taking a break there at the COVID inquiry with Baroness Hallett there just drawing proceedings to a close. We have got Stephen Pound with us and Emma Webb. Emma, let me come to you first. Regardless of where you sit on the decisions that were made and whether you are pro-lockdown or more sceptical about lockdowns, this is infuriating to watch.
Yeah, absolutely. It's round and round and round in circles.
It is, isn't it?
And I think a lot of people are already sick of COVID. They're sick of Boris. They're sick of the constant Conservative Party infighting. I think generally people have become sick of politics. I think they've been fatigued by the COVID years. They've been fatigued by the impact of lockdown. And people want something positive. They want to see a government that can act, that can, execute things quickly and efficiently. And I think this adds even more to the general fatigue.
We want people to look forward. We need to look forward, Stephen, and we need this wrapped up quickly with conclusions to be drawn, and it's going to drag on for years.
Well, one of my New Year's resolutions is to stop agreeing with Emma Webb at every opportunity because I'm a little worried that my socialist credentials are being diluted and challenged. But look, I'm attracted by the Swedish model on this. They did it on time, on budget, in 3 months, and they asked themselves one question, not who's to blame, because you cannot go back and say, but what can we do to prepare for the future?
Shouldn't that be the point of this inquiry?
Andrew, you know and I know that there's going to be an inquiry into the COVID inquiry.
Yeah.
It's going to. I don't know what it is about this country. We seem to be obsessed with sort of inward-looking and navel-gazing. Can't we just say, look, it was hellish, it was awful, we survived. What can we do to make sure it doesn't happen again?
We've got to go to Chris Hope. We'll come back to the panel. We're going to Chris Hope in Downing Street because there's some breaking news about the former Home Secretary, Suella Braverman.
Andrew Bev, huge news in Westminster as well as in Paddington, where Boris Johnson is giving his evidence to the COVID inquiry. Suella Braverman will give a resignation statement after PMQs today in Parliament. Now, these statements are justifying why they think that they left office. His last one was given by Sajid Javid when he said enough was enough about Boris Johnson. It won't be so devastating about Mr. Sunak's leadership. It'll be about the issue of immigration, whether the UK should withdraw from the ECHR in order to ensure that this Rwanda plan works. But this Westminster is febrile today, because there are also ministers on resignation watch about which way the government goes on this new bill to disapply elements of the ECHR and allow these flights to take off to Rwanda. Some ministers might resign on the left of the party if it goes too hard. And on the right, Immigration Minister Robert Jenrick could have run out of road by tomorrow. So while everyone's watching the Boris Johnson inquiry correctly, there's a lot going on in Westminster. We'll be hearing from Suella Braverman shortly after PMQs. That statement is heard in silence by convention. the PM must sit there and listen to what she says, because right now MPs on the right of the party are desperate for the party to take a stronger approach on Rwanda and migration and controlling these small boats. And there's a big concern on the right that the PM won't go far enough when he signs off the bill, which will be published tomorrow.
Just a day or two after James Cleverly, who succeeded her as Home Secretary, announced his own five-point crackdown on migration. Many of those points he announced, those policies he announced, I think she may well be telling us this afternoon she tried to get through but was blocked by number 10.
Indeed, and also I think some of those measures which were announced by James Cleverly didn't go far enough for many certainly allies of Suella Braverman. One MP ally told me this speech will be something like Geoffrey Howe's speech in 1990, which of course led to the attempt by Michael Heseltine to bring down Margaret Thatcher. Now, no one is saying that will happen in the content of this speech, but Westminster is febrile, Andrew and Bev, today, because I think for many this is a real issue, an existential issue maybe, for Mr Sunak to get right. I'm turning over my shoulder because he's about to leave right now for Prime Minister's questions, which will happen, the last but one before Christmas. And after that, Suella Braverman, who's wearing a very resplendent red dress, I think Bev might like it if she sees it, when she gives her statement from the back benches in the House of Commons shortly.
Just explain to us how she is able to make such a statement on a day like today. How unusual is this?
It's very unusual. I mean, I think she's been trying to make this statement. She hasn't actually spoken, Bev and Andrew, at all in public, in a broadcast way, about why she was sacked by Rishi Sunak, I think 2 or 3 weeks ago last Monday. She gave one interview to a Sunday newspaper. She's written comment pieces, but we haven't actually heard from her until now. And the timing is absolutely crucial, because right now the government is signing off on this Rwanda plan, and it's whether they go really hard to withdraw from elements of the ECHR, the European Court's jurisdiction, to make this happen, or will they dodge that and go weaker and the plan won't work. And this is why this statement is so well timed in terms of the debate on Rwanda and immigration and net migration, and the reason why she's doing it. Well, when you leave office in government, you can give a statement to the House of Commons about why you've left. Whether you're sacked or resigned, it doesn't matter. She's taken up that option. These are very rarely granted by the Speaker of the House of Commons. The last one was by Sajid Javid, who resigned in July last year, and he set in train the events which brought down Boris Johnson, don't forget. Now, no one's saying this will be as big this time, but there is real concern on the right of the party that this Rwanda plan, when it comes out tomorrow, will not be strong enough to make the plan work. And I think this is part of this attempt by the right to reorientate what Mr Sunak might try and do later today when he signs off on the plan. It is very dramatic. I mean, if you weren't watching Boris Johnson right now, you'd be here watching every word of what happens this afternoon in Commons.
Absolutely. Her letter, of course, her memorable letter, excoriating is the word that people often use about that letter that she wrote. And in it, she expressed her frustration that Rishi Sunak never listened to her. Now, the beauty of this, of course, is that he will be sat there and he will have to listen to her today, won't he, Chris? And all eyes will be on him for his reaction.
There'll be 2 cameras, well, 1 camera, but everyone will be watching, won't they? Mr Sunak sitting there having to suck it up, while behind him his former Home Secretary attacks the immigration plans that he's put out there, wonders why they can't be harder, wonders why the UK can't just leave the European Court of Human Rights' jurisdiction and actually deliver on this promise to stop the boats, because there is real concern from people, I understand, senior in government, that the plan to PM2 out tomorrow does not go far enough. I think right now, there's a live debate right now that Mr Sunak can be brought round into being tougher, and this is a part of the Tory right in full view to persuade the Prime Minister to be firmer on Rwanda. It is really dramatic, and it will be played out on the cameras on GBNews all afternoon.
I like her. I can't lie, I like her style enormously. I love the way she's handled this. She wrote a piece in her own words in the paper. She's going to stand there in the House of Commons and she's going to force him to listen to her whether he likes it or not. I mean, she is a massive thorn in his side though, Chris, isn't she?
Yeah, but she wouldn't see it that way. I do know her pretty well over the past 2 or 3 years. I mean, she's quite a kind of gently spoken person, but what she says is she fundamentally believes this. So she fundamentally believes in Brexit. She fundamentally believes in the need to deal with immigration, as do, in fact, a lot of ministers who work in the Home Office. When you're exposed to the reality of what has been uncontrolled net migration and the issue of the small boats, people do come round and they can become pretty hard line pretty quickly. The frustration, I think, for those in the Home Office is that isn't shared by other parts of government because they're insulated from it. They're not seeing it every single day. And I think she understands that, and she absolutely to her core is a right-wing Tory, and that's why the base love her, and that's why she's such a threat, I think, to well, not a threat at the moment to the leadership, but I think after any election, were the Tories to lose it and were Mr Sunak to stand aside, should be a favourite to take over.
I wonder if he has any regrets about sacking her from this position.
Probably not. Their relationship had broken down completely.
But she's in a place now where she can cause him nothing but headaches.
Absolutely.
Because she knows that department better than anyone else. His Achilles heel right now is immigration. She just keeps kicking him in it over and over again, and she has great credibility when she does so. You can't help but feel maybe he should have handled this differently and somehow kept her close.
She's punching the bruise, isn't she?
Yes, Stephen Pound is here. We're going to keep the camera on you, Chris, because we do want to see Rishi Sunak leaving Downing Street.
That's the expression I've been looking for.
We can hear the voice of Stephen Pound.
Stephen Pound, you and I were almost certainly in the Commons chamber when Geoffrey Howe made that memorable resignation.
Isn't it interesting, Andrew, the point
that
Chris Hope just made there about her being sort of quietly spoken? We said that same thing about Geoffrey Howe. I served in the House with Fernandez, as she was then. She was very quietly spoken. When Geoffrey Howe came up with this line, he said, it's like the batsman going to the crease to find the captain's broken your bat. And then we had the Lawson thing about in power, but, you know, in office, but not in power.
That was
Lawson.
No, that was Norman Lamont.
Norman, I beg your pardon. How could I confuse two right-wing chancellors?
Yes,
But look, the reality is, very often it's the quiet ones, the silent assassins that do the most damage. But look, I know, I was in the Whip's office when these things used to happen. At this moment, they will be running around like headless chickens, trying to pack the chamber, because what they are terrified of, firstly, is that Suella Braverman is heard in silence. That, you know, secondly, that there is no one actually supporting the Prime Minister on the front bench. He will be forcing people in there. But the other thing, they'll see who's donutting her, who's going to be sitting around her, because this is
the people who will be running her leadership campaign.
Well, you know, read the runes. Absolutely, I'm pretty sure that's what's going to be happening. It puts Labour in an odd position because, you know, we're just going to have to sit back and just watch this happen.
Well, you've been doing that for ages. You haven't been doing anything.
But it's been working, hasn't it?
You've had 13 years of that.
20 points ahead of
nothing. By doing nothing.
Well, it's principled inaction.
Yes, is that what do you think, Emma?
Oh, it's all very exciting, isn't it? I agree with Bev. I love Suella. I think that we need people like her in the Conservative Party because, I mean, Rishi appointing David Cameron shows just how awry things have gone to Groundhog Day. I'm very excited to hear, and actually impatient to hear what she's going to say. And as Stephen was saying, to see who's sitting around her, because that's going to be there aren't very many things that can be used at the moment in this sort of chaotic situation to read the signs of the times, to have a sense of how things might unfold as things go forward towards the general election, then potentially afterwards. And this will be a really good opportunity, just looking at the constellation of people physically around Suella, to get a sense of how things might play out.
It'll also be interesting to see which cabinet ministers are on the front bench, because sometimes they can find reasons not to be in the House of Commons for Prime Minister's questions, and I can imagine one or two of them may be
I can think of at least one Chancellor of the Exchequer who will certainly be busy somewhere else.
Yeah, exactly.
But where Suella Braverman speaks from, normally you've got Theresa May sits on the right on that corner, which she's made her seat, and then you've got Michael Fabricant who's just to the left. So at the moment, I think her people will be organising that donut. But it's who those people are.
I tell you, the person who would definitely be next to her, he's a man called Sir John Hayes. You know John Hayes.
Yes, I know John Hayes.
He used to run a group called the Cornerstone Group. Can you believe there's a group called that? He is her...
We used to call it the Gravestone Group.
I know you did. He is her chief lieutenant, and he's her organiser on the backbenches. And he will be running her leadership campaign, because she will definitely run next year.
Will she?
Oh, for sure.
She will wait until after the election.
Yeah. Which the Tories will lose, because it's looking pretty bleak at the moment, very bleak. And I'm still now of the view, more than ever, that it will be an election by no later than May or June.
I don't think you can overstate how important and how valuable what's going to happen this afternoon is. I find it quite frustrating that this COVID inquiry is taking place this morning, because what's happening in Westminster right now is so important, because this is the key issue that is going to, one of the key issues is going to decide the next election.
Sure.
But it's also one of the most important issues to the British public. So the importance of what is said, how this goes, and the surrounding context is a pivotal moment going forward. I don't think the importance can be overstated.
It will define the fissures within the Conservative Party.
Yes, it will.
I mean, I have to say...
It used to be Europe.
I was dreading long COVID. It's long COVID inquiry that I'm doing at the moment, to be honest.
And we're all suffering from it.
Europe was the issue.
It was.
And in many ways, it's actually factored
It is, again,
that.
because it's the European Court, which, of course, isn't part of the European Union. We're going to go back to the COVID inquiry. I know you're excited to get back to hear Boris Johnson, if you're listening on the radio and watching on TV, because he's back being grilled, or should we say lightly flambéed, by the lawyer.
Against this.
Around about the 7th of January, you say he rang you again on the 22nd of January. To put this in its proper chronological place, the first Sage had taken place on the 22nd of January, the first Cobra on the 24th of January. He says, however, in his witness statement that he called you directly on at least 4 occasions during January to try and impress upon you his concerns. Although he does not say so, the implication is that he was at pains to try to alert you to the problem as he saw it, and he was required to raise the matter with you repeatedly. Do you recall a repeated number of attempts to raise the alarm with you in that way?
I certainly recall the conversation on the 7th of January, and the context, and I remember thinking about it and saying to him, well, keep an eye on it, and I've set out in my statement my initial instincts about it. I don't, to be frank, remember all those conversations, but it's true that we would have spoken on many occasions, because we generally spoke quite a lot. I think that in that period, January really to the end of February, towards the end of February, COVID was pretty much like a cloud on the horizon, no bigger than a man's hand, and you didn't know whether it was going to turn into a typhoon or not. And I certainly didn't. I was unsure, and it became clear much later.
The matter was first raised with your Cabinet Secretary, Mark Sedwill, formally on the 21st of January, which was the date, in fact, of the World Health Organization first novel coronavirus situation report. Do you recall when the matter was first brought officially to your attention? You were obviously aware from news reports, and you'd been aware from your conversations with Mr. Hancock as to the possible crisis or the emergence of this virus in China. But when officially do you recall it was put before you?
I'm sure it's in my in what I've submitted to the inquiry, Mr. Keith. I think certainly there are cabinet discussions in January and in February, and a crescendo of activity about it. But in government, it wasn't yet being escalated to me as something of really truly national concern.
Indeed. A Cobra was convened, chaired by Mr. Hancock, on the 24th of January. And then he chaired a further Cobra meeting on the 29th of January, then the 5th of February, then the 18th of February, and then the 26th of February. Right. It's plain that was quite permissible. Cobra doesn't have to be chaired by a Prime Minister. Yep. Indeed, it can be chaired by an official. But the sheer frequency of those Cobras, there were then 5 Cobras within 1 month, all on the same issue of this emerging virus. Didn't the seriousness of the position in late January make itself plain to you? How could there have been a need for a Cobra every week for 5 weeks in relation to an issue that didn't require your direct involvement as the Prime Minister?
I think for the reason you've given, which is that a Cobra is a regular occurrence in government when there's something that a particular government department is leading on. In this case, it was health. The possibility of a coronavirus pandemic, which was only declared by the WHO on the 12th of March, was not something that had yet been, hadn't really broken upon the political world, certainly in my consciousness, as something of real potential, a real potential national disaster. And in that period, end of January, beginning of February, it's end of January, beginning of February, it's not much in the political world. I wasn't asked about it, for instance, at all at PMQs.
Were you even aware that Mr. Hancock was chairing COBRAs to deal with a new and emerging respiratory virus on those 5 dates?
I think that I was aware that Matt was handling it. I couldn't swear that I was aware that he was handling it in that way on all those particular dates. My instructions to him were to keep me posted, and I would do whatever I could. But by the end of the month, clearly, by the end of February, I'm getting anxious about what we're doing.
We'll come there. Did you, or do you recall having any debate with your advisors as to whether or not you should be chairing those COBRAs, or whether or not the seriousness of the position required you to chair the COBRAs at the end of January and throughout February?
Yes, I think there's an exchange. I remember talking to my private office and saying, this is clearly becoming an issue of national
24th of February.
Thank you.
Before that date, for the month beforehand, did you think to say to your officials, the Secretary of State for Health is chairing a COBRA now on a weekly basis to do with a fatal viral pandemic, which currently is just spreading.
It hadn't yet been declared as a pandemic.
It hadn't been declared as a pandemic, but by the 16th of January, it had spread to Thailand and Japan. The scientists in the United Kingdom had reported on the 12% hospitalisation rate. It was clear from the material in government that only a small fraction of the infections in Wuhan were being detected, and there was already evidence of limited human-to-human transmission, all by the 16th of January. So, in an overarching sense, why do you think that the Prime Minister, yourself, was not informed earlier as to those extremely worrying features of this emerging virus?
I think that here's what I really think happened. I think that actually everybody, had they stopped to think about it, could see the implications of the data, the implications of what was happening in the numbers, the percentage of fatalities in China. But I don't think that they necessarily drew the right conclusions in that early phase, and which is no fault of theirs. I think what happened was something that was completely outside people's living memory. What we were dealing with is like a once-in-a-century event. And I just don't think people computed the implications of that data. And it wasn't really escalated. It wasn't escalated to me as an issue of national concern until much later. And as you say, I said, look, I think I've got to chair these COBRAs.
You were the Prime Minister. You're obviously an extremely skilled politician, and you have direct, intimate experience of running government. From the viewpoint of the bereaved and those who are terribly damaged and harmed by this pandemic, how could a government have generally failed to stop and think? The system is there to make you think. The risk assessment processes and civil emergency procedures are there to make sure that you don't have to stop and think. It responds. But on this occasion, generally, and it's not a personal point, generally the system did not stop and think and say, this data shows there is a greater problem than we currently understand.
I think that's. I think I've tried in a way to give you the answer to that. I think that what really happened was outside our living experience. We hadn't seen something like this for a century or more. And unfortunately, what we did remember was not helpful, because what the system did remember, was things like SARS and MERS and swine flu and so on, other zoonotic diseases that certainly had an impact in Asia, which is what we were seeing, but ultimately were relatively, if not wholly, benign in the UK. And if I had to guess an answer to your question, Mr. Keith, I would say that was probably the default mindset, and that was basically because of people were operating on the basis of their lived experience.
So a failed mindset.
I think it was a human natural response of people based on what they had themselves seen and observed in their lifetimes.
But from the context, from the prism or from the viewpoint of the efficacy and the competence of the government response, regardless of the psychological issues that may have been preying on the minds of its constituent individual parts, that the government failed to wake up, did it not? It failed to understand the significance of the crisis, and therefore it must follow, failed to take steps speedily enough.
I think that it would certainly be fair to say of me, the entire Whitehall establishment, scientific community included, our advisors included, that we underestimated the scale and the pace of the challenge. And you can see that very clearly in those early days in March, from late February through to the sequence of NPIs, of lockdowns. You can see that we were all collectively underestimating how fast it had already spread in the UK. We underestimated. We put the peak too late. The first peak too late. We thought it would be in May, June. That was totally wrong. I don't blame the scientists for that at all. But that was the feeling, and it just turned out to be wrong.
But the evidence before Milady shows that the scientists, at least in part, were aware by the end of January of the hospitalisation rate, of the fact that the number of infections was being grossly underestimated, that there was self-sustaining human-to-human transmission. They were aware by the beginning of February that there was no effective test, trace, control, isolate system in the United Kingdom. So once the virus spread beyond China and became self-sustaining, there was no effective means of stopping its entry into the United Kingdom. That was all known to the scientists, at least by the beginning of February. Why wasn't it known to the
on the test, trace,
to ministers?
On the test, trace and isolate, on the whole diagnostics question, I think if you look at the evidence, you can see actually that we were being assured, I was being assured that we were in a good place on that until it became clear that wasn't quite right.
But I'm asking you about the system. Forgive me. I'm asking you about the system. If the scientists knew and had the data from which the government could draw the proper conclusions, why didn't the government systemically rise up in light of these alarm bells and do something?
Well, I don't wish to say that we were oblivious, because we weren't. And actually, a lot of work went on, a lot of planning, a huge amount of discussion. So I think, I'm talking quite a lot now. So I think the CMO first briefed me about it on about the 4th of February, and we talk about what could happen. SAGE, as you say, is meeting. It's not as though nothing is happening.
No.
I think that what is going wrong, possibly, is that we are just underestimating the pace, the contagiousness of the disease, and you can see very clearly from that crucial moment of transition from the 12th to the 13th of March, how radically the scientific appreciation of the situation changed. SAGE on one day was...
Forgive me, Mr. Johnson. I'm asking about January and February, where we haven't got to March yet. When did you first become aware that the test and trace system, whilst extremely efficient in practice, could not be extended beyond the first few hundred cases? That it was a system designed for high consequence infectious diseases. It dealt with travellers, it dealt with index cases, but it couldn't really be expanded beyond 10 or 20 index cases and 500 or 600 contacts.
Yes, you're going to have to forgive me, Ms. Gill. I can't remember exactly when it became obvious that test and trace wasn't going to work, but there came a point quite early on when I think Chris or Patrick said, look, test and trace isn't relevant anymore because of the spread of the disease. I couldn't date that.
From which you then, of course, appreciated that if the virus spread outside China and was self-sustaining, and it had already,
yes, I'm sorry, that was probably much later in March.
All right, you think that was later in March?
I think so, but I couldn't swear to it.
There was a box note on the 30th of January, 136734. This is an email from a member of your office, Mr. Johnson, to post the private office support team. Grateful if you could include the below in the box tonight. Prime Minister, to be aware, the Chinese government granted the permission for the flight to evacuate British nationals from Wuhan, so we're concerned here with repatriation. If we then go over the page, there's a reference to WHO expected to declare a public health emergency of international concern. And then also to be aware, the FCO is drawing down non-official staff across the network in China. The day before, on the 29th of January, there was a COBRA 56226. You weren't, of course, at that COBRA, Mr. Johnson. You've explained how you didn't chair a COBRA until March. If we look at page 5, we will see that the chair, Mr. Hancock, hears from the CMO and Public Health England about the fatalities in China. There was evidence of human-to-human transmission, and Germany had 4 confirmed cases. And then at paragraph 3, the CMO said the UK planning assumption were based on a reasonable worst-case scenario. There were 2 scenarios to be considered. The first was that the spread was confined within China. The second was that the spread was not limited to China, and there would be a pandemic-like scenario with the UK impacted. The second scenario was plausible, but it may take weeks to months. The CMO sets out there in COBRA, and my lady's heard evidence on this, that it was understood that if the second scenario came to pass, there would be a pandemic, because once control had been lost, a viral wave was inevitable.
Yes.
This is a COBRA that takes place on that day, the 29th of January. The following day, you receive a box note, which appears to be solely concerned with repatriation. The question is, why were you, the Prime Minister, not being told directly this is a virus which, if it escapes China, will result in a pandemic? There is information already that it has a very serious fatality rate and a very serious hospitalisation rate. Why was that basic light bulb information not brought to your attention so that you could see the true nature of this emerging crisis?
I think that I can't give you the exact reason why that COBRA was not brought to my attention. That detail of the COBRA was not brought to my attention. But I can say that at that stage, I think that even concept of a pandemic did not necessarily imply to the Whitehall mind the kind of utter disaster that COVID was to become. And if I may, and that may sound odd, but what I'm trying to say is that I think people were still operating they were still thinking about things like an influenza pandemic, or some of the other diseases that I've mentioned.
Well, this material, along with a plethora of other documents, shows that the reasonable worst-case scenario was already being envisaged, and that was a reasonable worst-case scenario which denoted deaths to the tune of 800,000 people. So it couldn't have been unknown to Whitehall, but you say the eventuality was not aware.
I didn't see that figure, and I mean, I saw a different figure, I think, towards the end of February, by which time our alarm was really truly raised. But I'm trying to give you my best explanation for why people were in the mindset that they were in.
There was a cabinet on the 31st of January, 56125. If we go to page 10, please, we can see the nature of the debate. It was, of course, chaired by you that afternoon. And the Secretary of State for Health and Social Care, Mr. Hancock, says 2 cases have been confirmed in the United Kingdom. They had been, of course, confirmed on the 30th and the 31st of January. It was a very serious problem in China, a large number of cases and fatalities. And then the debate moves on to the typical infection rate of 2.5 to 3 people, and the mortality rate 2%.
Yes.
So if the reproduction value is 2.5 to 3, that is to say 1 person will infect 2.5 to 3 people in an unimmunized population, and the mortality rate, 2% of people who were infected, or perhaps confirmed cases, it's not clear, means a very, very large number of people will die. Correct?
That's right.
The debate in Cabinet, page 10 and 11, deals with repatriation. The Department for International Development examines developing countries where the risk of spread of the disease was high. Spread of the disease globally would be a big problem for those countries and could also mean further evacuation of British nationals. So the debate focuses almost exclusively around the position abroad, the repatriation issue, and despite the reference to the mortality rate, the reproduction figure, and the knowledge which was already in the possession of government that there was confirmed cases outside China with sustained human-to-human transmission, nobody stopped to say this means inevitably a huge number of deaths, a wall of death, and this country, if it escapes China, being overrun by the virus.
Yes, I think the word inevitably there is the one that I would pick up on, because I think if you look at what the Secretary of State for Health told the Cabinet, he said if the Chinese grip it, then it won't be a problem. But if China don't grip it, then that could be very serious. But your point is still basically a good one, which is that we had to think about what happened if China didn't grip it, and I think we just have to put our hands up here and say, look, I think because of the absence of collective memory, because we were operating under a different set of assumptions, I don't think that we were able to comprehend the implications of what we were actually looking at. And I think that, let me put it a different way. I think if we, as I said right at the beginning, if we had collectively stopped to think about the mathematical implications of some of the forecasts that were being made, and we believed them, we might have operated differently. The problem was that I don't think we attached enough credence to those forecasts, and because of the experience that we'd had with other zoonotic diseases, I think collectively in Whitehall, there was not a sufficient loud enough klaxon of alarm. I don't blame people, I just think it was because of the experience that they'd had all their lives.
The material, Mr. Johnson, shows how at various stages you warned against overreaction. You made the point that SARS and MERS had not turned out to be as serious for the United Kingdom as some had feared at the time. BSE had not resulted in the levels of deaths which some had forecast. So may we take it that you put yourself in that category of people who had insufficient credence?
I was agnostic. I thought.
But Mick should just have made an executive decision. This is a car crash. But he never does.
So this is, of course, Boris Johnson at the COVID inquiry. Still talking, in my opinion, a little bit too much about who said what. He's doing a pretty good job, I would say, of kind of getting the lead on Hugo Keith KC. Stephen, what do you make of his performance? He's very calm.
Well, no, I have to say, people are expecting him to explode and start losing his temper, start throwing his arms about, blah, blah, blah. But no, he's been very calm, very measured. But at the end of the day, is the nation better off because of spending millions of pounds and having, Premier News Channel devoting so much time to this thing when I should imagine most people know that there's not going to be an outcome. Nobody's going to come back from the dead. The families of those people who suffered the agonies during COVID are not going to be satisfied. They're not going to be reassured. I'm sorry. I think it's a waste of time. And I think, in answer to your question, Boris has played a good straight bat on this. But, can we just move on and talk stumps, please?
Well, we've got another day and a half of this, Stephen. So maybe he will be pressured into saying something he perhaps otherwise wouldn't say. But of course, he's prepared for hours for this. I mean, I was reading the other day that he's been locked away with his lawyers for the best part of last week.
And we're paying for those lawyers, by the way.
We are.
We were saying...
Well, I think we should, because he's responding in his role as Prime Minister. I think we should be paying for that. But I don't think we should be paying for £200 million from public inquiry that's going to go on for 3 years.
I mean, in terms of explaining the amount of money that's been spent as well, the amount of work that must have gone into collating all of these text messages and that kind of thing, the amount that they must have gone through in order to prepare for this. Yeah. He's doing, what is advisable, answering honestly, it seems, bare minimum, clear answers. There's a lot. But it must have been, very, very intense for him to prepare for this. But like Stephen has said, I think this is going to drag on for a very long time. It's not going to undo the generation of children that are not going to be able to read or do maths or will suffer further down the line as a result of this. And also, I think by the time we get to the end of it, people will be so fatigued that it will just be memory hold.
We were talking to Arlene Foster earlier, of course, who was First Minister in Northern Ireland. She was talking about the pressure she was under when she took the decisions to close down schools. I mean, there's just this report that's been published. They're saying the progress we've made in our schools has gone back, and that's because of COVID. Because of the lockdown.
Yeah, I was actually on this very channel last night on Headline as they were talking about this issue.
Yeah.
And particularly, those kids who were who during COVID were at that important moment when in your schooling where things really start to sink in. That we're not going to know the consequences of that until much, much further down the line, until the point at which they are, about to go to university, that kind of thing. So
it's almost a lost generation, isn't it?
It is. Yeah, it really is.
Imagine those people, when they're applying for jobs in 10, 12 years' time, people their marks are not going to be as good and they're not going to be as well-rounded and as well-educated.
And Stephen, anyone in education will tell you they've lost it forever. Because if they weren't in school for 2 years, that's 6 months at least they've lost.
Yeah, but the gaps in knowledge are huge. Right, I want to move on to PMQs, guys. We've got PMQs are going to be on in just about 5 minutes or so. Emma, it's going to be a goodie with Suella Braverman ready to throw Rishi Sunak to the wolves about immigration.
I can't wait. I'm going to do a Tom Harwood and I'm going to get my popcorn out and watch it with great interest.
He's got his popcorn now. He never shares it with us. Do you notice
No,
that?
I didn't notice.
He never shares his jammy Dodgers either.
So,
well, he knows it's going to be quite a blockbuster this afternoon.
Super Bowl.
But PMQs will be... Because the Prime Minister is going to be under pressure on immigration, on the splits in the Tory party, potentially resignations over the Rwanda plan, and, of course, Suella, who's going to speak. I mean, that's all eyes will be on Suella Braverman.
Well, this could be the opening salvo in, really, the end game, the final war. This really could be it.
It's the canary in the coal mine, the litmus test, or whatever other analogy you want to go to for the future of the Conservative Party. This is really very important.
We just had a glimpse in the chamber. There's no sign of either the Prime Minister or Suella Braverman yet, so is she going to make a very melodramatic or even dramatic entrance?
Well, this is a question. Will she upstage him?
Yes.
Because what could happen is he could come, as you know and I know, that the Prime Minister appears like 2 minutes before behind the Speaker's chair. He pauses by the Speaker's chair to enable everybody to come, the whips to orchestrate the applause. What happens if Suella comes in at the same time and she's got a seat reserved right behind him?
This is posturing for leadership as well. How prime ministerial will she be when she delivers
Well, she's wearing a red dress, apparently. What does that signify?
Mary, Queen of Scots wore a red dress for her execution.
Indeed.
It was the symbol of the martyr.
It was.
Don't you think?
I'm suddenly feeling quite self-conscious sat here in my very red dress.
No, that's Marie. That's Marie. Of course, at the moment, it is Welsh questions, which isn't always, unless you're in Wales, the most thrilling question time.
But they've got 20-mile-an-hour speed limits in Wales and sort of 3-mile-an-hour speed limits when it comes to Welsh debate, I have to say.
And can we just remind people why they've got a 20-mile-an-hour speed limit in Wales, Stephen? Because of your stupid Welsh Labour government in Wales.
Is the COVID inquiry still on?
Yeah. And they've also got very bad NHS figures and very bad education.
Well, they do suffer.
Labour in government
There's a historical
are not
overhang, from a post-industrial society, because, I mean, you don't forget, the steelworks, the pits, people are only just recovering from it. We've got to give them at least another century to recover.
Stephen, you've been running Wales since devolution. That's a very long time.
Not actually. No, there's a 4-year period when we didn't.
Right.
Well...
So
we are going to be going over to the House of Commons
so you're
any minute now. We're just hanging on.
Home Secretary, you're not interested in Prime Minister's questions, are you, today?
No, not at all. I'm just waiting for the statement from Suella Braverman. I think that this is going to be fascinating.
She doesn't normally disappoint, does she? Stephen?
I don't know whether she's got a great deal of form on this. I mean, the key thing here is normally she's quite understated. I mean, she's actually preserves her her bile and this excoriation, as Beverly so rightly said earlier on, for the written word. She's not normally known to be a Demosthenes on the green benches. She doesn't normally boom her. But I think she'll speak quietly, but it'll be more in sorrow than in anger. I think that will be her line. And I think a lot of people will be looking quite ashamed as they're sitting around her. And there'll be, I think, a movement towards her, a physical movement towards her in the chamber, and that'll be very interesting.
We need to get some facial expression analysts to look at the body language.
I don't think you'll have to be an expert to work it out this afternoon.
And I wonder if Kemi Badenoch will be on the front bench today. She's the business development
100%
secretary,
guaranteed,
because she, of course, is, in my view, potentially a much more serious contender to be the next Tory leader.
Yeah, I mean, I think she's got a bigger reach out in the country, because Suella still does have that reputation. But I think Kemi Badenoch is someone who's got the intellect, she's got the appeal, and she's got the charisma, or the riz, I think you young people call it.
Let's say hello to Tom and Emily. They're waiting.
He's got all that popcorn.
Tom and Emily with their popcorn.
Well, Bev and Andrew, you keep mentioning all this popcorn. I've got 2 bowls today because I thought we'd have 2 big events, Boris Johnson and Prime Minister's questions. I should have got a third, because of course we're getting Suella Braverman's big statement as well. We're going to bring all the juicy bits, the interesting bits, and digest exactly what it means for us.
What is she going to say? Is she going to lay into the Prime Minister? Is she going to lay into the government's immigration plans? Is this her posturing to be the next Prime Minister?
Could it be a Geoffrey Howe moment? The moment that, in effect, brought down Margaret Thatcher back in 1990. We've got the popcorn at the ready. We'll be looking at it. But also, of course, we've looked at some of the interesting bits of the COVID inquiry. The COVID lawyer,
some of the interesting bits,
has been telling fibs. We're going to go through what the actual charts say compared to what he has been telling Boris Johnson. It's all to come, of course, after Prime Minister's questions.
Brilliant. OK, thank you, Tom and Emily. Tom there he looks a bit like Eat Out to Help Out. He just kind of reminds me, stood there with his bowls there.
Dubbed Eat Out to Help Out the virus.
To throw up.
Yeah.
I was just thinking then what Tom was saying actually about the fact that people will be looking at the figures of what Boris was saying. The beauty of this COVID inquiry, to some extent, and I know we've been quite very derogatory about it, is that we can take what he says now, and the likes of us can go away and look at it. But I think that just adds to the frustration, maybe, Steve.
I think it does. What's interesting, I think initially, when the inquiry was launched, the indication was to actually throw Boris under the bus. You know, the idea
I think it still is.
And, well, Hancock has not covered himself in glory, obviously. No. But for me, the really interesting, the revelation, the sort of the takeaway for me, is the infighting amongst the so-called experts. I mean, you've got 6 or 7 experts, and I think we had 5 different groups, you know, these sort of vaccination groups and the emergency groups. Yeah. None of them could seem to agree amongst themselves.
Which, Emma, makes me think that with the World Health Organization's pandemic treaty on the horizon and the international health regulation changes going through, isn't this just going to conclude, well, you lot can't sort it out amongst yourselves. We need the grown-ups. We need the people who are running the World Health Organization to take this out of your silly little democratic hands.
Well, that's a very legitimate fear. And I think that the problem with this inquiry is that the whole purpose of investigating these things is to ensure that we don't make the same mistakes again. Exactly. But it's going to take so long until we reach a conclusion. And that conclusion is probably going to be woolly and equivocal. And as you say, I think that there will be many people who are concerned that this will basically just conclude the government was incompetent. We need to outsource ourselves to the adults, the international adults.
The globalists. Another pandemic comes along before the inquiry's finished. I mean, what happens then? What lessons have we learned?
How do you do it dragging our feet?
Do you think the World Health Organization is going to say to France, you know, you can't go out tonight to Le Bistro, you've got to stay at home? The French are going to say, oh, mais c'est de moi, pas de problème. You know, the World Health Organization doesn't have that sort of power.
Oh, watch this space, Mr. P. This comes on to what we were discussing earlier, though, about you were a big fan of a digital ID system, a regulation of humanity, and some people would say...
A membership card for the society that is this country.
It won't be this country, unfortunately.
We've already got one, effectively. Every time you use your Oyster card or your credit card, they know so much about us.
Do we have one, Emma?
Digital footprint. I mean, we need to...
It's true, isn't it?
I'm with Bev on this. We need to resist all of that kind of thing.
It's almost here already, isn't it? That's my point.
No, it's completely nowhere near being here.
It's moving in that direction, but it should be resisted, and any kind of digital identification would just be consolidating a power that could be abused.
Absolutely, and that's my concern with the COVID inquiry.
And is that too much to ask to know who's actually in this country? The only way to know that is with ID cards.
Yeah, and of course there'll be a lot more in this country when Labour win the election, because they won't even try and stop the boats.
We did last time. You won't. We did it last time, and we'll do it next time.
No, we're getting ready for Prime Minister's questions. Tom and Emily will be in the hot seat when that happens. It's going to be a pretty feisty occasion, I think. And pure theatre afterwards, because Suella Braverman, the former Home Secretary, delivers a resignation statement. The convention tradition is heard in silence.
You know...
nobody willing to contradict her.
We spend so much time listening to Boris Johnson today that we barely listen to what you have to say at home, and, of course, that is always important. So I'll read out a few of your emails before Rishi Sunak steals the limelight this morning. This afternoon, Stephen has said, like a lot of people, I'm fed up with the inquiry. It's going on too long, costs far too much. It's probably having a negative effect. It'd be more helpful to move on. What is it achieving? A lot of you, Jan, saying it's a ridiculous waste of money. The whole exercise is not focused on how to react better in the future. It's hijacked by uncaring lawyers who are only interested in dragging this out to make money for themselves. There appears to be no loyalty to UK taxpayers. Heather has said this inquiry is being used as a vehicle to destroy Boris Johnson and the Conservative Party. She might be right about that.
Who's the Deputy Speaker in the chair?
Well, it's unusual because maybe the Speaker's sick or he's got an alternative, but...
he won't be the only
COVID. Yeah, because of COVID.
Because of the inquiry?
No, I think he's got COVID.
Oh, I see.
Speaker's got COVID, yep. Keep up. Sir Lindsay Hoyle's got COVID, so he's obviously
Who's still testing for that kind of thing?
I know, good these vaccines.
And before I answer my honourable friend's question, I know the whole House will also want to join me in offering our condolences to the family and friends of Alistair Darling, Glenys Kinnock and Lord James Douglas Hamilton. They made each an enormous contribution to public life and will be deeply missed. Madam Deputy Speaker, the Hillsborough families have suffered multiple injustices. The loss of 97 lives, the blaming of the fans and the unforgivable institutional defensiveness by public bodies. I'm profoundly sorry for what they have been through. Today, the government has published its response to Bishop James Jones's report to ensure the pain and the suffering of the Hillsborough families is not repeated. I'm immensely grateful they have shared their experiences. I hope to meet them in the new year, and the Justice Secretary will be making an oral statement after PMQs. Turning to honourable friend's question, the government is continuing to work closely with the Mayor of the West Midlands to fully develop his plans to deliver growth.
Sir Michael Fabricant. Well, firstly, may I join the Prime Minister in his comments about the Hillsborough families. It's thanks to Margaret Thatcher and her robust treatment of militant trade unions in the West Midlands her contribution of £10 billion at today's prices to the motor industry in the West Midlands that iconic names like Jaguar and Land Rover still exist. Yeah. So does the Prime Minister share my boundless joy that on the road to Damascus, and in recognition of her great heritage and all that she achieved, another fanboy has joined her great belief, the leader of the opposition.
Prime Minister!
Madam Deputy Speaker, the Right Honourable Gentleman is a fantastic champion of his area, and because of the pro-business policies of this government, I'm delighted to see the billions of pounds of investment by JLR in their move towards electrification in the region. But he is absolutely right. I am always happy to welcome new Thatcherites from all sides of this House. But it does say something about the Leader of the Opposition that the main female strong leader that he could praise is Margaret Thatcher and not his own fantastic deputy.
Since question 1 was a closed question, we now go to question 2, Sarah Champion.
Yeah. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Question number 2.
Madam Deputy Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others. In addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
Sarah Champion.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The government is set to close the Household Support Scheme in March, cutting off crucial free meals for 12,000 Rotherham's children in the lowest income families. With the government's cost of living crisis in full swing and energy prices about to increase again, how does the Prime Minister justify taking food from the mouths of my poorest children?
Madam Deputy Speaker, what we are doing is ensuring that no child should grow up in poverty, and that's why not only this year we've provided considerable cost of living support worth over £3,000 to a typical household, more support this winter for pensioners, a record increase in the national living wage, and a full indexation and uplifting of welfare for the next financial year. But when it comes to children and food, Madam Deputy Speaker, not only do we fund the free school meals for almost 2 million children, we also introduced the holiday activity and food programme, which provides not just food but enriching activities to deprived children up and down the entire country, including in her local authority.
Ansel.
If there is one place where everyone should feel safe, it's in their own home. But the reality is that for some of the most vulnerable people, home is precisely where they can be most at risk. Terrorised by criminals who target them, move in, take control, and set up a base camp from where they sell drugs or facilitate prostitution in a horrendous form of exploitation known as cuckooing. It has happened in Eastbourne, and it is happening across the country. It is not an offence, but it should be, and wasn't cited in the Criminal Justice Bill debated last week. So can I ask my right honourable friend and the Home Secretary if they would meet with me and concerned colleagues to further discuss the issue?
Prime Minister.
I agree with my honourable friend that cuckooing is an abhorrent practice that does often prey on the most vulnerable in society. As part of the government's antisocial behaviour action plan, the Home Office engaged with relevant stakeholders about whether a new criminal offence was necessary. The results of that engagement demonstrated that there are a range of existing powers that can be used to disrupt this activity, but of course I'll ensure that the relevant minister meets with her and updates on the work we are doing to share effective practice to tackle this abhorrent problem.
Leader of the Opposition, Sir Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and it's very good to see you in your place, and we wish the Speaker a speedy recovery. This week we lost two giants of the Labour family, and I thank the Prime Minister for his comments. Alistair Darling was a man of unassuming intelligence, warmth and kindness. He brought a calm expertise and, in private, a cutting wit, and devoted his love of his family was ever present. Our thoughts are with Maggie, his wife, Callum, Anna, who he loved so dearly. Glenys Kinnock was a passionate campaigner for social justice who changed lives home and abroad. She was a loving and supportive partner and mother, and her death is a huge loss to all of us. We are thinking of Neil, of Stephen, Rachel, and of all the family. Can I also echo the Prime Minister's comments in relation to Lord Douglas Hamilton? And in relation to the Hillsborough families, they deserve justice. In a previous capacity, I worked with the families. They waited a very, very long time for the findings, thanks to people in this House, and they've waited a long time for this response, but I'm glad it is now coming. Madam Deputy Speaker, if the purpose of the Rwanda gimmick was to solve a political headache of the Tories' own making, to get people out of the country who they simply couldn't deal with, then it's been a resounding success. After all, they've managed to send 3 Home Secretaries there, an achievement for which the whole country can be grateful. So, apart from members of his own cabinet, how many people has the Prime Minister sent to Rwanda?
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, as I've been clear before, we will do everything it takes. Mr. Speaker, we will do everything it takes to get this scheme working so that we can indeed stop the boats. And that's why this week we have signed a new legally binding treaty with Rwanda, which together with new legislation will address all the concerns that have been raised, because everyone should be in no doubt about our absolute commitment to stop the boats and get flights off. Because, Madam Deputy Speaker, and this is the crucial point that the Honourable Gentleman doesn't understand, deterrence is critical. Even the National Crime Agency have said that you need an effective removals and deterrence agreement if you truly want to break the cycle of tragedy that we see. But what we heard this morning from his own ministers was that they would scrap the scheme even when it is operational and working. As again, once again, Mr. Speaker, once again, instead of being on the side of the British people, he finds himself on the side of the people smugglers.
Madam Deputy Speaker, when they first announced this gimmick, they claimed Rwanda would settle tens of thousands of people. Then the Deputy former Prime Minister quickly whittled it down to mere hundreds. Then the Court of Appeal in June made clear there's housing for just 100. The current number of people sent there remains stubbornly consistent, 0. At the same time, Madam Deputy, Article 19 of the treaty says the parties shall make arrangements for the United Kingdom to resettle a portion of Rwanda's most vulnerable refugees in the United Kingdom. So how many refugees from Rwanda will be coming here to the UK under the treaty?
Mr. Speaker, Madam Deputy Speaker, sorry.
Order! Prime Minister.
It addresses all the concerns of the Supreme Court. But it's a point of pride, Madam Deputy Speaker, that we are a compassionate country that does welcome people from around the world. But let me just get the Honourable Gentleman up to speed on what we are doing. Reduce the number of illegal arrivals from Albania by 90%. Increase the number of illegal working raids by 50%. Because of all the action, we've taken the number of small boat arrivals down by 1/3, Madam Deputy Speaker. But what is the Honourable Gentleman's plan? Because it comes down to he just simply doesn't have a plan to address this problem. But no, I'm probably being unfair because he does have a plan. It's to cook up a deal with the EU that would see us accept 100,000 illegal migrants.
Migration's trebled on his watch, and all he can do is make up numbers about the Labour Party. It's really pitiful. I'm not actually sure the Prime Minister can have read this thing. Article 4 says the scheme is capped at Rwanda's capacity. That's 100. Article 5 says Rwanda can turn them away if they want. Article 19 says we actually have to take refugees from Rwanda. How much did this fantastic deal cost us?
Prime Minister.
Madam Deputy Speaker, as the Home Secretary was crystal clear about, there is no incremental money. There is no incremental money that has been provided. This about is ensuring that the concerns of the Supreme Court have all been addressed in a legally binding treaty that will allow us to operationalise the scheme. But I'm glad he raised the topic of legal migration, which I agree is absolutely far too high, Madam Deputy Speaker. That's why this week we've outlined a plan bigger than any other government before to reduce the levels of legal migration by £300. It's an incredibly comprehensive plan. So if he cares so much about it, the simple question for him is, does he support the plan?
Madam Deputy Speaker, he clearly hasn't read it. And Annex A says, on top of the 140 million he's already showered on Rwanda, when we send people there under this treaty, we have to pay for their accommodation and their upkeep for 5 years. And that's not all. This morning, a government minister admitted that anyone we send to Rwanda who commits a crime can be returned to us. I'm beginning to see why the Home Secretary said the Rwanda scheme is something to do with bats, I think, wasn't it? What does he first think attracted Mr. Kagame to hundreds of millions of pounds for nothing in return?
Listen, I've slightly lost the thread of the question, Madam Deputy Speaker, but the simple point is, there's a simple question here. If you believe in stopping the boats, as we on this side of the House do, you need to have an effective deterrence and returns agreement. It's as simple as that. The honourable gentleman is not interested in stopping the boats, which is why he's not interested in the Rwanda plan. In fact, Madam Deputy Speaker, we know that they don't want to tackle this issue because even when this government was trying to deport foreign national offenders out of this country, they opposed it. Multiple members of his shadow front bench all signed a letter to me to that effect. But I don't need to tell him that because he signed it too.
Okay, that's enough. Sir Keir Starmer.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I would say that this treaty's got more holes in than a Swiss cheese, but I don't want to wind up the Prime Minister by talking about a European country again. Madam Deputy Speaker, you have to give credit to the Rwandan government. They saw this Prime Minister coming a mile off. You can only imagine their delight, their sheer disbelief, when having already banked £140 million of British taxpayer money without housing a single asylum seeker, the Prime Minister appears again with another offer they can't refuse. A gimmick that will send taxpayers' money to Rwanda, refugees from Rwanda to Britain, and won't stop the boats. It was mentioned of Margaret Thatcher earlier. Madam Deputy Speaker,
There's understandable excitement about the mention of name. But the House must listen to the Leader of the Opposition, Sir Keir Starmer.
Party go from up yours to laws to take our money, Kagame.
Mr. Speaker. Madam Deputy Speaker, when it comes to this European thing and Margaret Thatcher, this is the week that the Shadow Foreign Secretary, I think, didn't rule out rejoining the European Union. He can role-play Margaret Thatcher all he wants, but when it comes to Europe, his answer's the same. Yes, yes, yes!
Madam Deputy Speaker, forget the private jet. He's obviously on a private planet of his own. But as Daily Mail readers learned this week that the Prime Minister has begun to feel sorry for himself. He's even been heard comparing his plight to his beloved Southampton Football Club. I do think that's a bit harsh because Saints have been on an 11-game unbeaten run, while, as the song has it, the Prime Minister gets battered everywhere he goes. But if you want the perfect example of how badly the Tories have broken the asylum system, last week the Home Office admitted that 17,000 people in the asylum system...
Order! Order, come on. Sir Keir Starmer.
Thank you. If you want the perfect example of how badly they've broken the asylum system, Madam Deputy Speaker, last week the Home Office admitted that 17,000 people in the asylum system have disappeared. Their exact words, it's hard to believe this, we don't think we know where all these people are. Now, you might lose your car keys, you might lose your headphones, you might lose your marbles. How do you lose 17,000 people?
Prime Minister!
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, I mean, on the topic of football teams, he used to describe this Rwanda policy as immoral, and yet his football team has a Visit Rwanda badge on the side of them. But in the week when he made his big economy speech, we're still waiting to hear how he's going to borrow £28 billion and still cut taxes and reduce debt. It's same old thing. The sums don't add up. But while they're struggling with their calculator, we're getting on and delivering. A new treaty with Rwanda, the toughest ever measures to cut legal migration, our schools marching up the tables, and tax cuts for millions, Madam Deputy Speaker. So whether it's controlling our borders or lowering our taxes, just like the Saints, the Conservatives are marching on. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
And there we have it, the weekly exchange between Sir Keir Starmer and Rishi Sunak. Today, all about illegal migration.
A huge amount of heckling in the House there, in the chamber. Lots and lots of laughing, joking, but also quite a lot of angry voices and interruptions I could hear from the backbenches there. Quite a strong performance, perhaps, from Keir Starmer when it came to mocking the Prime Minister. But we'll get some reaction on what you at home made of that exchange, and also from our panellists in the studio.
Yes, and I think one of the interesting things to talk about is this joke that Keir Starmer made. Joining us in the studio is Khalid Mahmood, of course, the Labour MP for Birmingham... Perry Barr. And Khalid, first of all, it's a brave choice for the Labour leader to go in on illegal migration. This is something that your party has faced criticism for before.
Well, the party's received criticism, which is unwarranted, for the last 13 years. We've had a Conservative government who've not been able to deal with the boats. We've had over 70,000 people coming. Billions of pounds have been spent on this, which is absolutely ridiculous. And then you find out also legal migration has gone through the roof as well.
Well, Khalid, one of the questions that is often put to the Labour Party when they criticise the government on illegal migration and legal migration is, what would the Labour Party do differently? Because it's very easy to shout from the sidelines and say, you're doing the wrong thing, you haven't improved the situation, you haven't got the flights off to Rwanda. But what would the Labour Party under Keir Starmer do differently to what the Conservative Party is currently doing?
First of all, the Labour Party is not going to spend £140 million plus on the Rwanda deal. What it's going to do, first of all, have a decent agreement with the French, which we've not been able to have so far.
Well, that's not true, is it? We do have an agreement.
We haven't had an agreement that's worked. And that's the key. We haven't had additional NCA people out there to making sure that people are first not allowed to come off the beach. When you have people coming off the beach, that is the problem. Once they're in waters, then it's very difficult because you have a duty of care to their life. We can't obstruct them in any way, which will cause them to drown. So what you need to do is stop them there. And that's what we want to look at.
I went along with the Prime Minister to the Elysee Palace in February this year when it was the Anglo-French summit, and also, I should say, the British-French summit. And it was interesting because then they signed up to, for the first time, joint patrols on the beaches. Up until this year, it had always been French patrols, no British oversight. From this year, it has included British oversight. We've created a new facility as well in North France. We've sent the French a lot of money for it. But James Cleverly, when he became Home Secretary, was referencing how interceptions have gone up, but they can't catch every boat on the beach. There's only a limited amount of beach where they can get into those boats. But that cooperation is occurring.
It's occurring, but it's not effective. And what we want to do is have significant personnel there to monitor that beach, because we're not doing that at the moment. You have electronic devices, you have drones that you can put up to do that, and we're not doing all of those things that we can do. And this is where these deals have a huge amount of Swiss cheese holes in, and this is what Sakir is referring to, is we need watertight agreements where you have that 24-hour cover to stop the boats coming across.
Khalid, do you understand how that might sound to some of our viewers and listeners? Essentially, what the Labour Party would do is what the Conservative government is doing, but it would somehow be more efficient and it would somehow be more successful.
No, it's not somehow at all. It actually, what Sakir has pointed out today is that it would be efficient because you have a much tighter deal. The deal that we've got with Rwanda at the moment, the government has now had to pay some more money to make it work. We've got £5 billion a year going to these people, 70,000 people that we're trying to keep in. Out of that, we've lost 17,000 already. We don't know where they've gone to. And so these are the big issues that Sakir has highlighted, and he would address those issues, and that is the problem. The government's not been on top of that.
And may I ask you, with the net migration figures, we've seen immigration at record levels. Are you comfortable with immigration running in the hundreds of thousands?
Absolutely not. I'll tell you one thing. I had a meeting last week, and I'm continually having meetings with the DWP, where we got young people coming out of school who don't have qualifications. We've got people who want to move forward, haven't got the right qualifications to be able to move forward. So on this Friday, I'm speaking to the Skills Council in my constituency with the mayor. When I've spoken to the DWP, I've spoken to the police. I'm getting together a unit of people where we engage with our young people and some people who are not able to have English as a second language, which the funding's been cut for. So I want to train my own people in my constituency to take those jobs and have less people coming through.
That's really interesting. Would you therefore back the changes that the Home Office has put forward at the start of this week, raising that income threshold, tightening up the points-based system for inward migration that we do have?
No, because that doesn't work. And that's what the problem is. I want there to be properly trained people from my constituency, people from the United Kingdom, people from Birmingham, taking those jobs with the proper training, not...
But you wouldn't tighten up the system to allow people to come in?
No, because, you're not tightening up the system, because what they're doing, the limit that they're increasing to will not be able to get those jobs.
Well, hang on.
And that's the problem.
The shortage occupation list is something, getting rid of that and tightening that up is something that the Labour Party, the Labour leader, Keir Starmer, has said that he is in favour of. This is the 20% discount, essentially, that companies are allowed to recruit on to foreign workers, so essentially undercutting British workers. You'd be supportive of that measure so that businesses here cannot essentially undercut British workers?
No, because I want there, as somebody who's been a member of the union for a very long time, I want the unions to be engaged in people that are not undercutting other workers, and I want them at the same level. That's what I want. But I don't think the Conservative model works at the moment, because they're now based the price at such a high level. The people that we need, nurses, care workers, will not be on that list of salary that they're talking about. And certainly the issue of bringing spouses in is something that has to be looked at as well. So having over 750,000 people coming in legally, when you've got people who are not able to get the jobs, who are not able to do the work that they should be, and unemployment benefit. But the government is bringing in a policy saying we're going to take people off disability living allowance and put them back into work, but we're not going to train them. So that's the problem, is that we're going to look at this properly in a way to deal with this, so our own people are working.
But opposing that threshold rise for incoming people with regard to the amount that they're paid. Stay with us. We're going to dip in now to the COVID inquiry, where the former Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, is giving evidence. We'll see if he's got something interesting to say.
Note the reference to could die as opposed to would die once the virus has self-sustaining community transmission. The scientific advice is to use these numbers for planning. They're not a prediction. Did anybody at that meeting, or the meeting in which you had, and we'll come to the actual meeting itself in a moment, but did anybody at the meeting at which this paper was discussed ask Miss Hammond, why is the sole paper from the Civil Contingency Secretariat, the crisis management body in the heart of government, suggesting that these figures are not a prediction when, as you've just described, the information to Cobra on the 26th of February was saying the reasonable worst-case planning assumption looks close to becoming reality?
I can't answer that question, but it's a very good question.
Page 2, paragraph 9. The report says we need to strike a balance between taking precautionary steps and overreacting. As cases spread, the risk of overreacting is reducing. We're now planning for a potential global pandemic that would inevitably spread to the UK, so it would, in this paragraph, inevitably spread. Did you assess, reading this report, Mr. Johnson, that the reference to overreaction was long past and that, in fact, in the striking of that balance, there was now a real emergency and a need to take precautionary steps straight away?
I think that I found the paper very alarming, arresting. I think I remember going to talk to my officials about it, saying, which is it? A severe to mild flu pandemic or an RWCS of 520,000? Because I couldn't understand what I was being asked to anticipate.
So I've referred to the meeting. Your private secretary, Imran Shafi, refers at 146636 to the meeting. It's difficult to read his writing, but there is a reference to the PM asking, what's the strategy? There we are. Thank you. Prime Minister, what's the strategy? When are we going to take big decisions? Of what evidence? On what evidence? Of what evidence? And then you say biggest damage done by overreaction. So it looks from the face of this note that your sense that there was a real crisis, that you were extremely rattled, is prevalent in the first sentence. But in the second sentence, perhaps in reflection of the CCS report, you say the biggest damage is done by overreaction.
I think I'm leaving both possibilities open. Because that's how it still struck me. I think that in disasters such as this, the actions that government take inevitably also have costs, and I'm sure we're going to come on to this, but that's the balance you have to strike.
As the Prime Minister, instead of directing government to respond to the threat of a near existential crisis, you instead warned of the dangers of overreaction.
No, I say no. That's, well, forgive me. I say, when are we going to take some decisions, and on what evidence? Because I'm looking at a problem that's been presented to me. I need to know what the plan is going to